Section 49 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley, Volume 3, Chapter 13. It is the same, for be it joy or sorrow, the path of its departure still is free. Man's yesterday can ne'er be like his morrow, nor aught endure save mutability. Shelley. The month of June had commenced. In spite of lawyers' delays and the difficulties attendant on all such negotiations, they were at last concluded, and nothing remained but for Lady Lodore to sign the paper which was to consign her to comparative destitution. In all changes we feel most keenly the operation of small circumstances, and are chiefly depressed by the necessity of stooping to the direction of petty arrangements, and having to deal with subordinate persons. To complete her design, Lady Lodore had to make many arrangements, trivial yet imperative, which called for her attention, when she was least fitted to give it. She had met these demands on her patience without shrinking, and all was prepared for the finishing stroke about to be put to her plans. She dismissed those servants whom she did not intend to leave in the house for Ethel's use. She contrived to hasten the intended marriage of her own maid, so to disburthen herself wholly. The mode by which she was, solitary and unknown, to reach the mountains of Wales without creating suspicion or leaving room for conjecture was no easy matter. In human life one act is born of another, so that any one that disjoins itself from the rest instantly gives rise to curiosity and inquiry. Lady Lodore, though fertile in expedients, was almost foiled. The eligibility of having one confidant pressed itself upon her. She thought of Fanny Durham, but her extreme youth and her intimacy with Mrs. Villiers, which would have necessitated many falsehoods so to preserve the secret, deterred her. She determined at last to trust to herself alone. She resolved to take with her one servant only, who had not been long in her service, and to dismiss him immediately after leaving London. Difficulties presented themselves on every side, but she believed that they could be best surmounted by obviating them in succession as they arose, and that any fixed artificial plan would only tend to embarrass, while a simple mode of proceeding would continue unquestioned. Her chief art consisted in not appearing to be making any change at all. She talked of a visit of 2 or 3 months to Ems, and mentioned her intention of lending her house during the interval to her daughter. She thus secured to herself a certain period during which no curiosity would be excited, and after a month or two had passed away she would be utterly forgotten. Thus she reasoned. And whether it were a real tomb that she entered, or the living grave which she anticipated, her name and memory would equally vanish from the earth, and she be thought of no more. If Ethel ever entertained a wish to see her, Villiers would be at hand to check and divert it. Who else was there to spend a thought upon her? Alone upon earth, no friendly eye, solicitous for her welfare, would seek to penetrate the mystery in which she was about to envelop herself. The day came, it was the 2nd of June, when every preliminary was accomplished. She had signed away all that she possessed. She had done it with a smile, and her voice was unfaltering. The sum which she had saved for herself consisted of but a few £100, on which she was to subsist for the future. Again she enforced his pledge of secrecy on Mr. Gayland, and glad that all was over, yet heavy at heart in spite of her gladness, she returned to her home, which in a few hours she was to quit for ever. During all this time her thoughts had seldom reverted to Savile. Hope was dead, and the regrets of love had vanished with it. That he would approve her conduct was an idea that now and then flashed across her mind, but he would remain in eternal ignorance, and therefore it could not bring their thoughts into any communion. Whether he came to England or remained at Naples, availed her nothing. No circumstance could add to or diminish the insuperable barrier which his marriage placed between them. She returned home from her last interview with Mr. Gayland. It was 4 o'clock in the day. At 6 she had appointed Fanny Durham to call on her, and an hour afterwards the horses were ordered to be at the door, which were to convey her away. She became strangely agitated. She took herself to task for her weakness, but every moment disturbed yet more the calm she was so anxious to attain. She walked through the rooms of the house she had dwelt in for so many years. She looked on the scene presented from her windows. The drive in Hyde Park was beginning to fill with carriages and equestrians, to be thronged with her friends whom she was never again to see. Deep sadness crept over her mind. Her uncontrollable thoughts, by some association of ideas which she could not disentangle, brought before her the image of Lodore, with more vividness than it had possessed for years. A kind of wish to cross the Atlantic and to visit the scenes where he had dwelt so long arose within her, and then again she felt a desire to visit Longfield, and to view the spot in which his mortal remains were laid. As her imagination pictured the grave of the husband of her youth, whom she had abandoned and forgotten, tears streamed from her eyes, the first she had shed even in idea beside it. It is not to atone, for surely I was not guilty towards him, such were Lady Lodore's reflections, yet methinks, in this crisis of my fate, when about to imitate his abrupt and miserable act of self-banishment, my heart yearns for some communication with him, and it seems to me as if, approaching his cold, silent dust, he would hear me if I said, "Be at peace. Your child is happy through my means." Again her reveries were attended by a gush of tears. How strange a fate is mine, ever to be abandoned by, or to abandon, those towards whom I am naturally drawn into near contact. 15 years are flown since I parted from Lodore for ever. Then, by inspiring one so high-minded, so richly gifted as Savile, with love for me, fortune appeared ready to compensate for my previous sufferings. But the curse again operated, and I shall never see him more. Yet do I not forget thee, Savile, nor thy love, nor can it be a crime to think of the past, which is as irretrievable as if the grave had closed over it. Through Savile it has been that I have not lived quite in vain, that I have known what love is, and might have even tasted of happiness, but for the poison which perpetually mingles with my cup. I never wish to see him more, but if I earnestly desire to visit Lodore's grave, how gladly would I make a far longer pilgrimage to see Savile's child, and to devote myself to one who owes its existence to him. Wretched Cornelia, what thoughts are these? Is it now that you are a beggar and an outcast that you first encourage unattainable desires? Still, as she looked round and remembered how often Savile had been beside her in that room, thoughts and regrets thronged faster and more thickly on her. She recollected the haughty self-will and capricious coquetry which had caused the destruction of her dearest hopes. She took down a miniature of herself, which her lover had so fruitlessly besought her to give him. It was on the belief that she had bestowed this picture on a rival that he had so suddenly come to the determination of quitting England. It seemed now in its smiles and youth to reproach her for having wasted both, and the sight of it agitated her bosom, and produced a tumult of regret and despair at his loss, till she threw it from her, as too dearly associated with one she must forget. And yet wherefore forget? He had forgotten, but as a dead wife might in her grave love her husband, though wedded to another, so might the lost buried Cornelia remember him, though the husband of Clorinda. Self-compassion now moved her to tears, and she wept plentiful showers, which rather exhausted than relieved her. With a strong effort she recalled her sense of what was actually going on, and struggling resolutely to calm herself, she sat down and began a letter to her daughter, which was necessary as some sort of explanation at once to allay wonder and baffle curiosity. Thus she wrote: Dearest Ethel, my hopes have not been deceived. Mr. Gayland has at last contrived means for the liberation of your husband, and tomorrow morning you will leave that shocking place. Perhaps I receive more pleasure from this piece of good fortune than you, for your sense of duty and sweet disposition so gild the vilest objects, that you live in a world of your own, as beautiful as yourself, and the accident of situation is immaterial to you. It is not enough, however, that you should be free. I hope that the punctilious delicacy of Mr. Villiers will not cause you to reject the benefits of a mother. In this instance there is more of justice than generosity in my offer, and it may therefore be accepted without the smallest hesitation. My jointure ought to satisfy me, and the additional 600 a year, which I may call the price of blood, since I bought it at the sacrifice of the dearest ties and duties, is most freely at your service. It will delight me to get rid of it, as much as if thus I threw off the consciousness of a crime. It is yours by every law of equity, and will be hereafter paid into your banker's hands. Do not thank me, my dear child. Be happy. That will be my best reward. Be happy, be prudent. This sum will not make you rich, and the only acknowledgment I ask of you is that you make it suffice, and avoid debt and embarrassment. By singular coincidence, I am imperatively obliged to leave England at this moment. The horses are ordered to be here in half an hour. I am obliged, therefore, to forego the pleasure of seeing you until my return. Will you forgive me this apparent neglect, which is the result of necessity, and favor me by coming to my house tomorrow on leaving your present abode, and making it your home until my return? Miss Durham has promised to call here this afternoon. I shall see her before I go, and through her you will learn how much you will make me your debtor by accepting my offers, and permitting me to be of some slight use to you. Excuse the brevity and insufficiency of this letter, written at the moment of departure. You will hear from me again when I am able to send you my address, and I shall hope to have a letter from you. Meanwhile, heaven bless you, my angelic Ethel. Love your mother, and never, in spite of everything, permit unkind thoughts of her to harbor in your mind. Make Mr. Villiers think as well of me as he can, and believe me that your welfare will always be the dearest wish of my heart. Adieu. Ever affectionately yours, C. Lodore. She folded and sealed this letter, and at the same moment there was a knock at the door of her house, which she knew announced the arrival of Fanny Durham. She was still much agitated, and trying to calm herself, she took up a newspaper and cast her eyes down the columns, so by one of the most commonplace of the actions of our life to surmount the painful intensity of her thoughts. She read mechanically one or two paragraphs. She saw the announcements of births, marriages, and deaths. My moral death will not be recorded here, she thought, and yet I shall be more dead than any of these. The thought in her mind remained as it were truncated. Her eye was arrested, a paleness came over her, the pulses of her heart paused, and then beat tumultuously. How strange, how fatal were the words she read! Died suddenly at the inn at the Mola di Gaeta, on her way from Naples, Clorinda, the wife of the Honorable Horatio Savile, in the 22nd year of her age. Her drawing-room door was opened. The butler announced Miss Durham, while her eyes still were fixed on the paragraph. Her head swam round. The world seemed to slide from under her. Fanny's calm, clear voice recalled her. She conquered her agitation, She spoke as if she had not just crossed a gulf, not been transported to a new world, and again, swifter than light, brought back to the old one. She conversed with Fanny for some time, giving some kind of explanation for not having been to see Ethel, begging her young friend to press her invitation, and speaking as if in autumn they should all meet again. Fanny, philosophic as she was, regarded Lady Lodore with a kind of idolatry. The same charm that had fascinated the unworldly and abstracted Savile she exercised over the thoughtful and ingenuous mind of the fair young student. It was the attraction of engaging manners, added now to the sense of right, joined to the timid softness of a woman who trembled on acting unsupported, even though her conscience approved her deeds. It was her loveliness which had gained in expression what it had lost in youth, and kindness of heart was the soul of the enchantment. Fanny ventured to remonstrate against her sudden departure. "Oh, we shall soon meet again," said Cornelia, but her thoughts were more of heaven than earth as the scene of meeting, for her heart was chilled, her head throbbed. The words she had read operated a revolution in her frame, more allied to sickness and death than hope or triumph. Fanny at length took her leave, and Lady Lodore was again alone. She took up the newspaper. Hastily she read again the tidings. She sunk on the sofa, burying her face in the pillow, trying not to think, while she was indeed the prey to the wildest thoughts. Yes, thus ran her reflection, he is free. He is no longer married. Fool, fool! He is still lost to you, an outcast and a beggar. Shall I solicit his love, which he believes that I rejected when prosperous? Rather never, never let me see him again. My beauty is tarnished, my youth flown. He would only see me to wonder how he had ever loved me. Better hide beneath the mountains among which I am soon to find a home. Better, far better, die than see Savile and read no love in his eyes. Yet thus again I cast happiness from me. What then would I do? Unweave the web, implore Mr. Villiers to endure my presence, reveal my state of beggary, ask thanks for my generosity, and humbly wait for a kind glance from Savile to raise me to wealth as well as to happiness. Cornelia, awake! Be not subdued at the last. Act not against your disposition, the pride of your soul, the determinations you have formed. Do not learn to be humble in adversity, you who were disdainful in happier days. No! If they need me, if they love me, if Savile still remembers the worship, the heart's entire sacrifice which once he made to me, will a few miles, the obscurity of my abode, or the silence and mystery that surrounds me, check his endeavors that we should once again meet? No, she said, rising, my destiny is in other and higher hands than my own. It were vain to endeavor to control it. Whatever I do works against me. Now let the thread be spun to the end, while I do nothing. I can but endure the worst patiently, and how much better to bear in silence than to struggle vainly with the irrevocable decree. I submit. Let Providence work out its own ends, and God dispose of the being he has made, whether I reap the harvest in this world or in the next. My part is played. I will strive no more. She believed in her own singleness of purpose as she said this, and yet she was never more deceived. While she boasted of her resignation, she was yielding not to a high moral power, but to the pride of her soul. Her resolutions were in accordance with the haughtiness of her disposition, and she felt satisfied, not because she was making a noble sacrifice, but because she thus adorned more magnificently the idol she set up for worship, and believed herself to be more worthy of applause and love. Yet who could condemn even errors that led to such unbending and heroic forgetfulness of all the baser propensities of our nature? Nor was this feeling of triumph long-lived. The wounding and humiliating realities of life soon degraded her from her pedestal, and made her feel, as it were, the disgrace and indignities of abdication. Her travelling chariot drove up to the door, and after a few moments' preparation she was summoned. Again she looked round the room. Her heart swelled high with impatience and repining, but again she conquered herself. She took up her miniature. That now she might possess, for she could remember without sin. She took up the newspaper, which did or did not contain the fiat of her fate, but this action appeared to militate against the state of resignation she had resolved to attain, so she threw it down. She walked down the stairs and passed out from her house for the last time. She got into the carriage. The door was closed. The horses were in motion. All was over. Her head felt sick and heavy. She leaned back in her carriage, half stupefied. When at last London and its suburbs were passed, the sight of the open country a little revived her, but she soon drooped again. Nothing presented itself to her thoughts with any clearness, and the exultation which had supported her vanished totally. She only knew that she was alone, poor, forgotten. These words hovered on her lips, mingled with others by which she endeavored to charm away her despondency. Fortitude and resignation for herself, freedom and happiness for Ethel. Oh yes, she is free and happy. It matters not then what I am. No tears flowed to soften this thought. The bright green country, the meadows mingled with unripe cornfields, the tufted woods, the hedgerows full of flowers could not attract her eye. Pangs every now and then seized upon her heart. She had talked of resignation, but she was delivered up to despair. At length she sank into a kind of stupor. She was accompanied by one servant only. She had told him where she intended to remain that night. It was past 11 before they arrived at Reading. The night was chill, and she shivered while she felt as if it were impossible to move, even to draw up the glasses of her chariot. When she arrived at the inn where she was to pass the night, she felt keenly the discomfort of having no female attendant. It was new. She felt as if it were disgraceful to find herself alone among strangers, to be obliged to give orders herself, and to prepare alone for her repose. All night she could not sleep, and she became aware at last that she was ill. She burnt with fever. Her whole frame was tormented by aches, by alternate hot and shivering fits, and by a feeling of sickness. When morning dawned, it was worse. She grew impatient. She rose. She had arranged that her servant should quit her at this place. He had been but a short time with her, and was easily dismissed under the idea that she was to be joined by a man recommended by a friend who was accustomed to the Continent, whither it was supposed that she was going. She had dismissed him the night before. He was already gone, when on the morrow she ordered the horses. She paid the bills herself, and had to answer questions about luggage. All these things are customary to the poor and to the other sex. But take a high-born woman and place her in immediate contact with the rough material of the world, and see how, like a sensitive plant, she will shrink, close herself up and droop, and feel as if she had fallen from her native sphere into a spot unknown, ungenial, and full of storms. The illness that oppressed Lady Lodore made these natural feelings even more acute, till at last they were blunted by the same cause. She now wondered what it was that ailed her, and became terrified at the occasional wanderings that interrupted her torpor. Once or twice she wished to speak to the post-boy, but her voice failed her. At length they drove up to the inn at Newbury. Fresh horses were called for, and the landlady came up to the door of the carriage to ask whether the lady had breakfasted, whether she would take anything. There was something ghastly in Lady Lodore's appearance which at once frightened the good woman and excited her compassion. She renewed her questions, which Lady Lodore had not at first heard, adding, "You seem ill, ma'am. Do take something. Had you not better alight?" "Oh yes, far better," said Cornelia, "for I think I must be very ill." The change of posture and cessation of motion a little revived her, and she began to think that she was mistaken, and that it was all nothing, and that she was well. She was conducted into the parlour of the inn, and the landlady left her to order refreshment. "How foolish I am," she thought. "This is mere fancy. There is nothing the matter with me." And she rose to ring the bell, and to order horses, when suddenly, without any previous warning, struck as by a bolt, she fainted, and fell on the floor without any power of saving herself. The sound of her fall quickened the steps of the landlady, who was returning. All the chambermaids were summoned, a doctor sent for, and when Lady Lodore opened her eyes, she saw unknown faces about her, a strange place, and voices yet stranger. She did not speak, but tried to collect her thoughts, and to unravel the mystery, as it appeared, of her situation. But soon her thoughts wandered, and fever and weakness made her yield to the solicitations of those around. The doctor came, and could make out nothing but that she was in a high fever. He ordered her to be put to bed. And thus, Savile and Ethel, and all hopes and fears having vanished from her thoughts, given up to delirium and suffering, poor Lady Lodore, alone, unknown, and unattended, remained for several weeks at a country inn, under the hands of a village doctor, to recover, if God pleased, if not, to sink unmourned and unheard of into an untimely grave. End of Volume 3, Chapter 13.
Section 50 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley. Volume 3, Chapter 14. But if for me thou dost forsake some other maid, and rudely break her worshipped image from its base, to give to me the ruined place, then fare thee well. I'd rather make my bower upon some icy lake, when thawing suns begin to shine, than trust to love so false as thine. Lazar Rook. On the same day Mr. and Mrs. Villiers left their sad dwelling to take possession of Lady Lodore's house. The generosity and kindness of her mother, such as it appeared, though she knew but the smallest portion of it, charmed Ethel. Her heart, which had so long struggled to love her, was gladdened by the proofs given that she deserved her warmest affection. The truest delight beamed from her lovely countenance. Even she had felt the gloom and depression of adversity. The sight of misery or vice in those around her tarnished the holy fervour with which she would otherwise have made every sacrifice for Edward's sake. There is something in this world which, even while it gives an unknown grace to rough and hard and mean circumstances, contaminates the beauty and harmony of the noble and exalted. Ethel had been aware of this. She dreaded its sinister influence over Villiers, and in spite of herself she pined. She had felt with a shudder that in spite of love and fortitude, a sense chilling and desponding was creeping over her, making her feel the earth alien to her, and calling her away from the sadness of the scene, around to a world bright and pure as herself. Her very despair thus dressed itself in the garb of religion, and though these visitations of melancholy only came during the absence of Villiers, and were never indulged in, yet they were too natural a growth of their wretched abode to be easily or entirely dismissed. Even now that she was restored to the fairer scenes of life, compassion for the unfortunate being she quitted haunted her, and her feelings were too keenly alive to the miseries which her fellow creatures suffered, to permit her to be relieved from all pain by her own exemption. She turned from such reflections to the image of her dear kind mother with delight. The roof that sheltered her was hallowed as hers. All the blessings of life which she enjoyed came to her from the same source as life itself. She delighted to trace the current of feeling which had occasioned her to give up so much, and to imagine the sweetness of disposition, the vivacity of mind, the talents and accomplishments which her physiognomy expressed, and the taste manifested in her house, and all the things which she had collected around her evinced. In less than a month after their liberation, she gave birth to a son. The mingled danger and rejoicing attendant on this event imparted fresh strength to the attachment that united Edward to her, and the little stranger himself was a new object of tenderness and interest. Thus their days of mourning were exchanged for a happiness most natural and welcome to the human heart. At this time also Horatio Saville returned from Italy with his little girl. She was scarcely more than a year old, but displayed an intelligence to be equalled only by her extraordinary beauty. Her golden silken ringlets were even then profuse. Her eyes were as dark and brilliant as her mother's, but her complexion was fair, and the same sweet smile flitted around her infant mouth as gave the charm to her father's face. He idolized her, and tried by his tenderness and attention to appease, as it were, the manies of the unfortunate Clorinda. She, poor girl, had been the victim of the violence of passion and ill-regulated feelings native to her country, excited into unnatural force by the singularity of her fate. When Saville saw her first in her convent, she was pining for liberty. She did not think of any joy beyond escaping the troublesome impertinence of the nuns and the monotonous tenor of monastic life, of associating with people she loved, and enjoying the common usages of life, unfettered by the restrictions that rendered her present existence a burthen. But though she desired no more, her disgust for the present, her longing for a change, was a powerful passion. She was adorned by talents, by genius. She was eloquent and beautiful, and full of enthusiasm and feeling. Saville pitied her. He lamented her future fate among her unworthy countrymen. He longed to cherish, to comfort, and to benefit her. His heart, so easily won to tenderness, gave her readily a brother's regard. Others, seeing the active benevolence and lively interest that this sentiment elicited, might have fancied him inspired by a warmer feeling. But he well knew the difference. He ardently desired her happiness, but did not seek his own in her. He visited her frequently. He brought her books. He taught her English. They were allowed to meet daily in the parlour of the convent, in the presence of a female attendant, and his admiration of her talents, her imagination, her ardent comprehensive mind, increased on every interview. They talked of literature, the poets, the arts. Clorinda sang to him, and her fine voice, cultivated by the nicest art, was a source of deep pleasure and pain to her auditor. His sensibility was awakened by the tones of love and rapture. Sensibility, not, alas, for her who sang, but for the false and absent. While listening, his fancy recalled Lady Lodore's image, the hopes she had inspired, the rapture he had felt in her presence, the warm vivifying effect her voice and looks had on him were remembered, and his heart sank within him to think that all this sweetness was deceptive, fleeting, lost. Once overcome by these thoughts, he resolved to return suddenly to England, to make one effort more to exchange unendurable wretchedness for the most transporting happiness. Absence from Cornelia, to the joy of pouring out the overflowing sentiments of his heart at her feet. While indulging in this idea, a letter from his sister Lucy caused a painful revulsion. She painted the woman of the world, given up to ambition and fashion, rejoicing in his departure, and waiting only the moment when she might with decency become the wife of another. Saville was almost maddened. He did not visit Clorinda for 3 days. She received him when at last he came, without reproach, but with transport. She saw that sadness, even sickness, dimmed his eye. She soothed him. She hung over him with fondness. She sung to him her sweetest, softest airs. His heart melted. A tear stole from his eye. Clorinda saw his emotion. It excited hers. Her Neapolitan vivacity was not restrained by shame nor fear. She spoke of her love for him with a vehemence she felt, and youth and beauty hallowed the frankness and energy of her expressions. Saville was touched and pleased. He left her to meditate on this new state of things, for free from passion himself, he had never suspected the growth of it in her heart. He reflected on all her admirable qualities, and the pity it was that they should be cast at the feet of one of her own unrefined, uneducated countrymen, who would be incapable of appreciating her talents, even her love, so that at last she would herself become degraded, and sink into that system of depravity which makes a prey of all that is lovely or noble in our nature. He could save her. She loved him, and he could save her. Lost as he was to real happiness, it were to approximate to it if he consecrated his life to her welfare. Yet he would not deceive her. The excess of love which she bestowed demanded a return which he could not give. She must choose whether, such as he has, he were worth accepting. Actuated by a sense of justice, he opened his heart to her without disguise. He told her of his ill-fated attachment to another, of his self-banishment and misery. He declared his real and earnest affection for her, his desire to rescue her from her present fate, and to devote his life to her. Clorinda scarcely heard what he said. She felt only that she might become his, that he would marry her. Her rapture was undisguised, and he enjoyed the felicity of believing that one so lovely and excellent would at once owe every blessing of life to him, and that the knowledge of this must ensure his own content. The consent of her parents was easily yielded. The Pope is always ready to grant a dispensation to a Catholic wife marrying a Protestant husband. The wedding speedily took place, and Seville became her husband. Their mutual torments now began. Horatio was a man of high and unshrinking principle. He never permitted himself to think of Lady Lodore, and the warmth and tenderness of his heart led him to attach himself truly and affectionately to his wife. But this did not suffice for the Neapolitan. Her marriage withdrew the veil of life. She imagined that she distinguished the real from the fictitious, but her new sense of discernment was the source of torture. She desired to be loved as she loved. She insisted that her rival should be hated. She was shaken by continual tempests of jealousy, and the violence of her temper, restrained by no reserve of disposition, displayed itself frightfully. Seville reasoned, reproached, reprehended without any avail, except that when her violence had passed its crisis, she repented and wept and besought forgiveness. Ethel's visit had been a blow hard to bear. She was the daughter of her whom Seville loved, whom he regretted, on whom he expended that passion and idolatry to attain which she would have endured the most dreadful tortures. These were the reflections, or rather, these were the ravings of Clorinda. She had never been so furious in her jealousy, or so frequent in her fits of passion, as during the visit of the unconscious and gentle Ethel. The birth of her child operated a beneficial change for a time, and except when Seville spoke of England, or she imagined that he was thinking of it, she ceased to torment him. He was glad, but the moment was past when she could command his esteem, or excite his spontaneous sympathy. He pitied and he loved her, but it was almost as we may become attached to an unfortunate and lovely maniac. Less than ever did he seek his happiness in her. He loved his infant daughter now better than any other earthly thing. Clorinda rejoiced in this tie, though she soon grew jealous even of her own child. The arrival of Lord Maristow and his daughters was at first full of benefit to the discordant pair. Clorinda was really desirous of obtaining their esteem, and she exerted herself to please. When they talked of her return to England with them, it only excited her to try to render Italy so agreeable as to induce them to remain there. They were not like Ethel. They were good girls, but fashionable and fond of pleasure. Clorinda devised 1,000 amusements. Concerts, tableaux, the masquerades of the carnival were all put in requisition. They carried their zeal for amusement so far as to take up their abode for a day or two at Pompeii, feigning to be its ancient inhabitants, and bringing the corps operatique to their aid, got up Rossini's opera of the Ultimi Giorni di Pompeii among the ruins, ending their masquerade by a mimic eruption. These gaieties did not accord with the classic and refined tastes of Seville, but he was glad to find his wife and sisters agree so well, and under the blue sky and in the laughing land of Naples it was impossible not to find beauty and enjoyment even in extravagance and folly. Still, like a funeral bell heard amidst a feast, the name of England and the necessity of her going thither struck on the ear and chilled the heart of the Neapolitan. She resolved never to go, but how could she refuse to accompany her husband's sisters? How resist the admonitions and commands of his father? She did not refuse, therefore. She seemed to consent, while she said to Seville, "Poison, stab me, cast me down the crater of the mountain, exhaust your malice and hatred on me as you please here, but you shall never take me to England but as a corpse." Seville replied, "As you will." He was tired of the struggle, and left the management of his departure to others. One day his sisters described the delights of a London season, and strove to win Clorinda by the mention of its balls, parties, and opera. They spoke of Almack's and the leaders of fashion. They mentioned Lady Lodore. They were unaware that Clorinda knew anything of their brother's attachment, and speaking of her as one of the most distinguished of their associates in the London world, made their sister-in-law aware that when she made a part of it, she would come into perpetual contact with her rival. This allusion caused one of her most violent paroxysms of rage as soon as she found herself alone with her husband. So frantic did she seem, that Horatio spoke seriously to his father, and declared he knew of no argument nor power which could induce Clorinda to accompany them to England. "Then you must go without her," said Lord Maristow. "Your career, your family, your country, must not be sacrificed to her unreasonable folly." And then, wholly unaware of the character of the person with whom he had to deal, he repeated the same thing to Clorinda. "You must choose," he said, "between Naples and your husband. He must go. Do you prefer being left behind?" Clorinda grew pale, even livid. She returned home. Horatio was not there. She raved through her house like a maniac. Her servants even hid her child from her, and she rushed from room to room, tearing her hair and calling for Seville. At length he entered. Her eyes were starting from her head, her frame working with convulsive violence. She strove to speak, to give utterance to the vehemence pent up within her. She darted towards him, when suddenly, as if shot to the heart, she fell on the marble pavement of her chamber, and a red stream poured from her lips. She had burst a blood vessel. For many days she was not allowed to speak nor move. Seville nursed her unremittingly. He watched by her at night. He tried to soothe her. He brought her child to her side. His sweetness and gentleness and real tenderness were all expended on her. Although violent, she was not ungenerous. She was touched by his attentions and the undisguised solicitude of his manner. She resolved to conquer herself, and in a fit of heroism formed the determination to yield and to go to England. Her first words, when permitted to speak, were to signify her assent. Seville kissed and thanked her. She had half imagined that he would imitate her generosity and give up the journey. No such thought crossed his mind. Her distaste was too unreasonable to elicit the smallest sympathy, and consequently any concession. He thanked her warmly, it is true, and looked delighted at this change, but without giving her time to retract, he hurried to communicate to his relations the agreeable tidings. As she grew better she did not recede, but she felt miserable. The good spirits and ready preparations of Horatio were all acts of treason against her. Sometimes she felt angry, but she checked herself. Like all Italians, Clorinda feared death excessively. Besides that, to die was to yield the entire victory to her rival. She struggled, therefore, and conquered herself, and neither expressed her angry jealousy nor her terrors. She had many causes of fear. She was again in a situation to increase her family within a few months, and while her safety depended on her being able to attain a state of calm, she feared a confinement in England, and believed that it was impossible that she should survive. She was worn to a skeleton. Her large eyes were sunk and ringed with black, while they burned with an unnatural brilliancy, for her vivacity did not desert her, and that deceived those around. They fancied that she was convalescent, and would soon recover strength and good looks, while she nourished a deep sense of wrong for the slight attention paid to her sufferings. She wept over herself and her friendless state. Her husband was not her friend, for he was not her countryman, and full as Seville was of generous sympathy and kindliness for all, the idea of returning to England, to his home and friends, to the stirring scenes of life and the society of those who loved literature and were endowed with a spirit of liberal inquiry and manly habits of thinking, so absorbed and delighted him that he could only thank Clorinda again and again, caress her, and entreat her to get well, that she might share his pleasures. His words chilled her, and she shrunk from his caresses. "He's thinking of her, and of seeing her again," she thought. She did him the most flagrant injustice. Seville was a man of high and firm principle, and had he been aware of any latent weakness, of any emotion allied to the master passion of his soul, he would have conquered it, or have fled from the temptation. He never thought less of Lady Lodore than now. The unwonted gentleness and concessions of his wife, his love for his child, and the presence of his father and dear sisters, dissipated his regrets. His conscience was wholly at ease, and he was happy. Clorinda dared not complain to her English relatives, but she listened to the lamentations of her Neapolitan friends with a luxury of woe. They mourned over her as if she were going to visit another sphere. They pointed out the little island on a map, and seated far off as it was amidst the northern sea. Night and storms, they averred, perpetually brooded over it, while from the shape of the earth they absolutely proved that it was impossible to get there. It is true that Lord Maristow and his daughters and Seville himself had come thence. That was nothing. It was easy to come away. "You see," they said, "the earth slopes down, and the sun is before them. But when they have to go back, it is quite another affair. The Alps rise, and the sea boils over, and they have to toil up the wall of the world itself into winter and darkness. It is tempting God to go there. Oh, stay, Clorinda, stay in sunny Italy. Orazio will return. Do not go to die in that miserable birthplace of night and frost." Clorinda wept yet more bitterly over her hard fate, and the impossibility of yielding to their wishes. "Would to God," she thought, "I could abandon the ingrate, and let him go far from Italy and Clorinda, to die in his wretched country. Would I could forget, hate, desert him. Why do I idolize one born in that chilly land, where love and passion are unknown or despised?" At length the day arrived when they left Naples. It was the month of May, and very warm. No imagination could paint the glorious beauty of this country of enchantment on the completion of spring, before the heats of summer had withered its freshness. The sparkling waves of the blue Mediterranean encircled the land and contrasted with its hues. The rich foliage of the trees, the festooning of the luxuriant vines, and the abundant vegetation which sprung fresh from the soil, decorating the rocks, and mantling the earth with flowers and verdure, were all in the very prime and blossoming of beauty. The sisters of Seville expressed their admiration in warm and enthusiastic terms. The words trembled on poor Clorinda's lips. She was about to say, "Why then desert this land of bliss?" But Horatio spoke instead. "It is splendid, I own, and once I felt all that you express. Now a path along a grassy field, a hedgerow, a copse with a rill murmuring through it, a white cottage with simple palings enclosing a flower garden, the spire of a country church rising from among a tuft of elms, the skies all shadowy with soft clouds, and the homesteads of a happy, thriving peasantry, these are the things I sigh for. A true English home scene seems to me 1,000 times more beautiful, as it must be 1,000 times dearer, than the garish, showy splendor of Naples. Florinda's thoughts crept back into her chilled heart. Large teardrops rose in her eyes, but she concealed them, and shrinking into a corner of the carriage, she felt more lonely and deserted than she would have done among strangers who had loved Italy and participated in her feelings. They arrived at the inn called the Villa di Cicerone, at the Mola di Gaeta. All the beauty of the most beautiful part of the peninsula seems concentred in that enchanting spot. The perfume of orange flowers filled the air. The sea was at their feet, the vine-clad hills around. All this excess of loveliness only added to the unutterable misery of the Neapolitan girl. Her companions talked and laughed while she felt her frame convulsed by internal combats, and the unwonted command she exercised over her habitual vehemence. Horatio conversed gaily with his sisters, till catching a glimpse of the pale face of his wretched wife, her mournful eyes and wasted cheeks, he drew near her. "You are fatigued, dearest Clorinda," he said. "Will you not go to rest?" He said this in a tender, caressing tone, but she felt, he wants to send me away, to get rid of even of the sight of me. But he sat down by her, and perceiving her dejection, and guessing partly at its cause, he soothed her, and talked of their return to her native land, and cheered her by expressions of gratitude for the sacrifice she was making. Her heart began to soften, and her tears to flow more freely, when a man entered, such as haunt the inns in Italy, and watch for the arrival of rich strangers to make profit in various ways out of them. This man had a small picture for sale, which he declared to be an original Carlo Dolce. It was the head of a seraph, painted on copper. It was probably a copy, but it was beautifully executed. Besides the depth of color and grace of design, there was something singularly beautiful in the expression of the countenance portrayed. It symbolized happiness and love. A beaming softness animated the whole face. A perfect joy, an ineffable radiance shone out of it. Florinda took it in her hand. The representation of heartfelt gladness increased her self-pity. She was turning towards her husband with a reproachful look, thinking, "Such smiles you have banished from my face forever," when Sophia Saville, who was looking over her shoulder, exclaimed, "What an extraordinary resemblance! There was never anything so like." "Who? What?" asked her sister. "It is Lady Lodore herself," replied Sophia. "Her eyes, her mouth, her very smile." Lucy gave a quick glance towards her brother. Horatio involuntarily stepped forward to look, and then as hastily drew back. Clorinda saw it all. She put down the picture and left the room. She could not stay. She could not speak. She knew not what she felt, but that a fiery torture was eating into her, and she must fly. She knew not whither. Saville was pained. He hesitated what to do or say, so he remained. Supper was brought in, and Clorinda not appearing, it was supposed that she had retired to rest. In about an hour and a half after, Horatio went into her room, and to his horror beheld her stretched upon the cold bricks of the chamber, senseless. The moonbeams rested on her pale face, which bore the hues of death. In a moment the house was alarmed. The village doctor summoned, a courier dispatched to Naples for an English physician, and every possible aid afforded the wretched sufferer. She was placed on the bed. She still lived. Her faint pulse could not be felt, and no blood flowed when a vein was opened. But she groaned, and now and then opened her eyes with a ghastly stare, and closed them again as if mechanically. All was horror and despair. No help, no resource presented itself. They hung round her. They listened to her groans with terror, and yet they were the only signs of life that disturbed her death-like state. At last, soon after the dawn of day, she became convulsed. Her pulse fluttered, and blood flowed from her wounded arm. In about an hour from this time she gave birth to a dead child. After this she grew calmer and fainter. The physician arrived, but she was past mortal cure. She never opened her eyes more, nor spoke, nor gave any token of consciousness. By degrees her groans ceased, and she faded into death. The slender manifestations of lingering vitality gradually decreasing till all was still and cold. After an hour or two her face resumed its loveliness, pale and wasted as it was. She seemed to sleep, and none could regret that repose possessed that heart, which had been alive only to the deadliest throes of unhappy passion. Yet Saville did more than regret. He mourned her sincerely and deeply. He accused himself of hard-heartedness. He remembered what she was when he had first seen her, how full of animation, beauty, and love. He did not remember that she had perished the victim of uncontrolled passion. He felt that she was his victim. He would have given worlds to restore her to life and enjoyment. What was a residence in England, the promises of ambition, the pleasures of his native land, all that he could feel or know, compared to the existence of one so young, so blessed with heaven's choicest gifts of mind and person? She was his victim, and he could never forgive himself. For his father's and sister's sake he subdued the expression of his grief, for they also loved Clorinda, and were struck with sorrow at the sudden catastrophe. His strong mind also, before long, mastered the false view he had taken of the cause of her death. He lamented her deeply, but he did not give way to unavailing remorse, which was founded on his sensibility, and not on any just cause for repentance. He turned all his thoughts to repairing her errors rather than his own, by cherishing her child with redoubled fondness. The little girl was too young to feel her loss. She had always loved her father, and now she clung to his bosom and pressed her infant lips to his cheek, and by her playfulness and caresses repaid him for the tenderness that he lavished on her. After some weeks spent in the north of Italy, he returned to England with her. Lord Maristow and his daughters were already there, and had gone to Maristow Castle. Saville took up his abode with his cousin Villiers. His situation was new and strange. He found himself in the very abode of the dreaded Cornelia, yet she was away, unheard of, almost, it seemed, forgotten. Did he think of her as he saw the traces of bygone scenes around? He played with his child. He secluded himself among his books. He talked with Ethel of what had happened since their parting, and reproached Villiers bitterly for not having applied to him in his distress. But a kind of spell sealed the lips of each, and Lady Lodore, who was the living spirit of the scene around, the creator of its peace and happiness, seemed to have passed away from the memory of all. It was in appearance only. Not an hour, not a minute of the day passed that did not bring her idea to their minds, and Saville and Ethel each longed for the word to be uttered by either, which would permit them to give expression to the thoughts that so entirely possessed them. End of Volume 3, Chapter 14.
Section 51 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley, Volume 3, Chapter 15. The music of man's fair composition best accords when 'tis in consort, not in single strains. My heart has been untuned these many months, wanting her presence, in whose equal love true harmony consisted. Ford. At the beginning of September, the whole party assembled at Maristow Castle. Even Mrs. Elizabeth Fitzhenry was among the guests. She had not visited Ethel in London because she would not enter Lady Lodore's house, but she had the true spinster's desire of seeing the baby, and thus overcame her reluctance to quitting Longfield for a few weeks. Fanny Durham also accompanied them, unable to deny Ethel's affectionate entreaties. Fanny's situation had been beneficially changed. Sir Gilbert Durham, finding that his granddaughter associated with people in the world, and being applied to by Lord Marystowe, was induced to withdraw Mrs. Durham from her mean situation, and to settle a small fortune on each of her children. Fanny was too young and too wedded to her Platonic notions of the supremacy of mind to be fully aware of the invaluable advantages of pecuniary independence for a woman. She fancied that she could enter on the career, the only career permitted her sex, of servitude, and yet possess her soul in freedom and power. She had never, indeed, thought much of these things. Life was, as it concerned herself, a system of words only. As always happens to the young, she only knew suffering through her affections, and the real chain of life, its necessities and cares, and the sinister influences exercised by the bad passions of our fellow creatures, had not yet begun to fetter her aspiring thoughts. Beautiful in her freedom, in her enthusiasm, and even in her learning, but above all in the lively kindliness of her heart, she excited the wonder and commanded the affections of all. Savile had never seen anyone like her. She brought to his recollection his own young feelings before experience had lifted the painted veil which those who live call life, or passion and sorrow had tamed the ardor of his mind. He looked on her with admiration and yet with compassion, wondering where and how the evil spirit of the world would show its power to torment and conquer the free soul of the disciple of wisdom. Yet Savile's own mind was rather rebuked than tamed. He knew what suffering was, yet he knew also how to endure it, and to turn it to advantage, deriving thence lessons of fortitude, of forbearance, and even of hope. It was not, however, till the seal on his lips was taken off and the name of Cornelia mentioned that he became aware that the same heart warmed his bosom, as had been the cause at once of such rapture and misery in former times. Yet even now he did not acknowledge to himself that he still loved passionately, devotedly loved Lady Lodore. The image of the pale Clorinda stretched on the pavement, his victim, still dwelt in his memory, and he made a sacrifice at her tomb of every living feeling of his own. He fancied, therefore, that he spoke coldly of Cornelia with speculation only, while in fact, at the very mention of her name, a revulsion took place in his being. His eyes brightened, his face beamed with animation, his very figure enlarged, his heart was on fire within him. Villiers saw and appreciated these tokens of passion, but Ethel only perceived an interest in her mother, shared with herself, and was half angry that he made no professions of the constancy of his attachment. Still, day after day, and soon all day long, they talked of Lady Lodore. None but a lover and a daughter could have adhered so pertinaciously to one subject, and thus Savile and Ethel were often left to themselves, or joined only by Fanny. Fanny was very mysterious and alarming in what she said of her beautiful and interesting favourite. While Ethel lamented her mother's love of the continent, conjectured concerning her return, and dwelt on the pleasures of their future intercourse, Fanny shook her head and said it was strange, very strange, that not one letter had yet reached them from her. She was asked to explain, but she could only say that when she last saw Lady Lodore she was impressed by the idea that all was not as it seemed. She tried to appear as if acting according to the ordinary routine of life, and yet was evidently agitated by violent and irrepressible feeling. Her manner she had herself fancied to be calm, and yet it betrayed a wandering of thought, a fear of being scrutinized, manifested in her repetition of the same phrases, and in the earnestness with which she made assurances concerning matters of the most trivial import. This was all that Fanny could say, but she was intimately persuaded of the correctness of her observation, and lamented that she had not inquired further and discovered more. For, she said, the mystery, whatever it is, springs from the most honorable motives. There was nothing personal nor frivolous in the feelings that mastered her. And Fanny feared that at that very moment she was sacrificing herself to some project, some determination which, while it benefited others, was injuring herself. Ethel, with all her affection for her mother, was not persuaded of the justice of these suspicions, nor could be brought to acknowledge that the mystery of Lady Lodore's absence was induced by any motives as strange and forcible as those suggested by Fanny, but believed that her young friend was carried away by her own imagination and high-flown ideas. Savile was operated differently upon. He became uneasy, thoughtful, restless. 1,000 times he was on the point of setting out to find a clue to the mystery, and to discover the abode of the runaway, but he was restrained. It is usually supposed that women are always under the influence of one sentiment, and if Lady Lodore acted under the direction and for the sake of another, wherefore should Savile interfere? What right had he to investigate her secrets and disturb her arrangements? Several months passed. Mrs. Elizabeth Fitzhenry returned to Longfield, and still the mystery concerning Ethel's mother continued, and the wonder increased. Soon after Christmas, Mr. Gayland, who was also Lord Marystow's solicitor, came down to the castle for a few days. He made inquiries concerning Lady Lodore, and was somewhat surprised at her strange disappearance and protracted absence. He asked several questions, and seemed to form conclusions in his own mind. He excited the curiosity of all, yet restrained himself from satisfying it. He was evidently disquieted by her unbroken silence, yet feared to betray the origin of his uneasiness. While he remained, curiosity was dominant. When he went, he requested Villiers to be good enough to let him know if anything should be heard of Lady Lodore. He asked this more than once, and required an absolute promise. After his departure, his questions, his manner, and his last words recurred, exciting even more surprise than when he had been present. Fanny brought forward all he said to support her own conjectures. A shadow of disquiet crossed Ethel's mind. She asked Villiers to take some steps to discover where her mother was, and on his refusal argued earnestly, though vainly, to persuade him to comply. Villiers was actuated by the commonplace maxim of not interfering with the actions and projects of others. Lady Lodore is not a child, he said. She knows what she is about. Has she not always avoided you, Ethel? Why press yourself inopportunely upon her? But Ethel was not now to be convinced by the repetition of these arguments. She urged her mother's kindness and sacrifice, her having given up her home to them, her house still unclaimed by her, still at their disposal, and which contained so many things which must have been endeared by long use and habit, and the relinquishing of which showed something extraordinary in her motives. This was a woman's feeling, and made little impression on Villiers. He was willing to praise and to thank Lady Lodore for her generosity and kindness, but he suspected nothing beyond her acknowledged acts. Savile heard this disquisition. He wished Villiers to be convinced. He was persuaded that Ethel was right. He was angry at his cousin's obstinacy. He was miserable at the idea that Cornelia should feel herself treated with neglect, that she should need protection and not have it, that she should be alone and not find assistance urged upon her. He mounted his horse and took a solitary ride, meditating on these things. His imagination became heated, his soul on fire. He pictured Lady Lodore in solitude and desertion, and his heart boiled within him. Was she sick, and none near her? Was she dead, and her grave unvisited and unknown? A lover's fancy is as creative as a poet's, and when once it takes hold of any idea, it clings to it tenaciously. If it is thus even with ordinary minds, how much more with Savile, with all the energy which was his characteristic, and the latent fire of love burning in his heart. His resolution was sudden, and acted on at once. He turned his horse's head towards London. On reaching the nearest town, he ordered a chaise and 4 post horses. He wrote a few hurried lines announcing an absence of 2 or 3 days, and with the rapidity that always attended the conception of his purposes and their execution, the next morning, having travelled all night, he was in Mr. Galen's office, questioning that gentleman concerning Lady Lodore, and seeking from him all the light he could throw upon her long-continued and mysterious absence. Mr. Galen had promised Lady Lodore not to reveal her secret to Mr. or Mrs. Villiers, but he felt himself free to communicate it to any other person. He was very glad to get rid of the burden, and even the responsibility of being her sole confidant. He related all he knew to Savile, and the truth flashed on the lover's mind. His imagination could not dupe him. He could conceive and therefore believe in her generosity, her magnanimity. He had before in some degree divined the greatness of mind of which Lady Lodore was capable, though as far as regarded himself, her pride and his modesty had deceived him. Now he became at once aware that Cornelia had beggared herself for Ethel's sake. She had disposed of her jointure, given up the residue of her income, and wandered away, poor and alone, to avoid the discovery of the extent and consequences of her sacrifices. Savile left Mr. Galen's office with a bursting and a burning heart. At once he paid a warm tribute of admiration to her virtues, and acknowledged to himself his own passionate love. It became a duty in his eyes to respect, revere, adore one so generous and noble. He was proud of the selection his heart had made, and of his constancy. "My own Cornelia," such was his reverie, "how express your merit and the admiration it deserves? Other people talk of generosity and friendship and parental affection, but you manifest a visible image of these things, and while others theorize, you embody in your actions all that can be imagined of glorious and angelic." He congratulated himself on being able to return to the genuine sentiments of his heart, and in finding reality give sanction to the idolatry of his soul. He longed to pour out his feelings at her feet, and to plead the cause of his fidelity and affection, to read in her eyes whether she would see a reward for her sufferings in his attachment. Where was she to receive his protestations and vows? He half forgot, in the fervour of his feelings, that he knew not whither she had retreated, nor possessed any clue whereby to find her. He returned to Mr. Galen to inquire from him, but he could tell nothing. He went to her house and questioned the servants. They remembered nothing. At last he found her maid, and learnt from her where she was accustomed to hire her post horses. This was all the information at which he could arrive. Going to Newman's with some difficulty, he found the post boy, who remembered driving her. By his means he traced her to Reading, but here all clue was lost. The inn to which she had gone had passed into other hands, and no one knew anything about the arrivals and departures of the preceding summer. He made various perquisitions, and lighted by chance on the servant she had taken with her to Reading, and there dismissed. From what he said, and a variety of other circumstances, he became convinced that she had gone abroad. He searched the foreign passport office, and found that one had been taken out at the French ambassador's in the month of April by a Mrs. Fitzhenry. He persuaded himself that this was proof that she had gone to Paris. It was most probable that, impoverished as she was, and desirous of concealing her altered situation, that she should, as Lodore had formerly done, dismiss a title which would at once encumber and betray her. He immediately resolved to cross to France, and yet for a moment he hesitated and reflected on what it was best to do. He had given no intimation of his proceedings to his cousin, and they were unaware that his journey was connected with Lady Lodore. He had a lover's wish to find her himself to be the only source of consolation, the only mediator to restore her to her daughter and to happiness. But his fruitless attempts at discovery made him see that his wishes were not to be effected easily. He felt that he ought to communicate all he knew to his cousins, and even to ensure their assistance in his researches. Before going abroad, therefore, he returned to Marystow Castle. He arrived late in the evening. Lord Marystow and his daughters were gone out to dinner. The three persons whom Savile especially wished to see alone occupied the drawing-room. Edward was writing to his father, who had advised him, now that he had a son, entirely to cut off the entail and mortgage a great part of the property. It was a distasteful task to answer the suggestions of unprincipled selfishness. While he was thus occupied, Ethel had taken from her desk her mother's last letter, and was reading it again and again, weighing every syllable, and endeavoring to discover a hidden meaning. She went over to the sofa on which Fanny was sitting to communicate to her a new idea that had struck her. The studious girl had got into a corner with her Cicero and was reading the Tusculan questions, which she readily laid aside to enter on a subject so deeply interesting. Savile opened the door and appeared most unexpectedly among them. His manner was eager and abrupt, and the first words he uttered were, "I am come to disturb you all, and to beg of you to return to London. No time must be lost. Can you go to-morrow?" "Certainly," said Villiers, "if you wish it." "But why?" asked Ethel. "You have found Lady Lodore," exclaimed Fanny. "You are dreaming, Fanny," said Ethel. "You see Horace shakes his head. But if we go to-morrow, yet rest to-night. You are fatigued, pale, and ill, Horace. You have been exerting yourself too much. Explain your wishes, but take repose and refreshment." Savile was in too excited a state to think of either. He repelled Ethel's feminine offers till he had related his story. His listeners heard him with amazement. Villiers' cheeks glowed with shame, partly at the injustice of his former conduct, partly at being the object of so much sacrifice and beneficence on the part of his mother-in-law. Fanny's color also heightened. She clasped her hands in delight, mingling various exclamations with Savile's story. "Did I not say so? I was sure of it. If you had seen her when I did on the day of her going away, you would have been as certain as I." Ethel wept in silence. Her heart was touched to the core. The remorse of love awakened in it. How cold and ungrateful had been all her actions. Engrossed by her love for her husband, she had bestowed no sympathy, made no demonstrations towards her mother. The false shame and Edward's oft-repeated arguments, which had kept her back, vanished from her mind. She reproached herself bitterly for lukewarmness and neglect. She yearned to show her repentance, to seek forgiveness, to express, however feebly, her sense of her mother's angelic goodness. Her tears flowed to think of these things, and that her mother was away poor and alone, believing herself wronged in all their thoughts, resenting perhaps their unkindness, mourning over the ingratitude of her child. When the first burst of feeling was over, they discussed their future proceedings. Savile communicated his discoveries and his plan of crossing to France. Villiers was as eager as his cousin to exert himself actively in the pursuit. His ingenuous and feeling mind was struck by his injustice, and he was earnest in his wish to atone for the past, and to recompense her, if possible, for her sacrifices. As every one is apt to do with regard to the ideas of others, he was not satisfied with his cousin's efforts or conclusions. He thought more questions might be asked, more learnt at the inns on the route which Lady Lodore had taken. The passport Savile had imagined to be hers was taken out for Dover. Reading was far removed from any road to Kent. They argued this. Horatio was not convinced. But while he was bent on proceeding to Paris, Edward resolved to visit Reading, to examine the neighbourhood, to re-question the servants, to put on foot a system of inquiry which must in the end assure them whether she was still in the kingdom. It was at once resolved that on the morrow they should go to London. Thither they accordingly went. They repaired to Lady Lodore's house. Savile on the next morning departed for France, and a letter soon reached them from him saying that he felt persuaded that the Mrs. Fitzhenry was Lady Lodore, and that he should pursue his way with all speed to Paris. It appeared that the lady in question had crossed to Calais on the 11th of June, and intimated her design of going to the Bagnières de Bigorre among the Pyrenees, passing through Paris on her way. The mention of the Bagneres de Bigorre clinched Savile's suspicions. It was such a place as one in Lady Lodore's position might select for her abode. Distant, secluded, situated in sublime and beautiful scenery, singularly cheap, and seldom visited by strangers. Yet the annual resort of the French from Bordeaux and Lyons civilized what otherwise had been too rude and wild for an English lady. It was a long journey thither, the less wonder that nothing was heard, or seen, or surmised concerning the absentee by her numerous acquaintances, many of whom were scattered on the continent. Savile represented all these things, and expressed his conviction that he should find her. His letter was brief, for he was hurried, and he felt that it were better to say nothing than to express imperfectly the conflicting emotions alive in his heart. "My life seems a dream," he said at the conclusion of his letter, "a long, painful dream. Since last I saw her, I awake, she is not here. I go to seek her, my actions have that single scope, my thoughts tend to that aim only. I go to find her, to restore her to Ethel. If I succeed in bestowing this happiness on her, I shall have my reward, and whatever happens, no selfish regret shall tarnish my delight." He urged Villiers, meanwhile, not to rely too entirely on the conviction so strong in himself, but to pursue his plan of discovery with vigor. Villiers needed no spur. His eagerness was fully alive. He could not rest till he had rescued his mother-in-law from solitude and obscurity. He visited Reading. He extended his inquiries to Newbury. Here more light broke in on his researches. He heard of Lady Lodore's illness, of her having resided for several months at a villa in the neighbourhood, while slowly recovering from a fever by which, for a long time, her life had been endangered. He heard also of her departure, her return to London. Then again all was obscurity. The innkeepers and letters of post-horses in London were all visited in vain. The mystery became as impenetrable as ever. It seemed most probable that she was living in some obscure part of the metropolis. Ethel's heart sunk within her at the thought. Edward wrote to Savile to communicate this intelligence, which put an end to the idea of her being in France. But he was already gone on to Bagneres. He himself perambulated London and its outskirts, but all in vain. The very thought that she should be residing in a place so sad, nay, so humiliating, without one gilding circumstance to solace poverty and obscurity, was unspeakably painful, both to Villiers and his wife. Ethel thought of her own abode in Duke Street during her husband's absence, and how miserable and forlorn it had been. She now wept bitterly over her mother's fate. Even Fanny's philosophy could not afford consolation for these ideas. An accident, however, gave a new turn to their conjectures. In the drawer of a work table, Ethel found an advertisement cut out of a newspaper, setting forth the merits of a cottage to be let near Raider Gowery in Radnorshire, and with this a letter from the agent at Raider, dated the 13th of May, in answer to inquiries concerning the rent and particulars. The letter intimated that if the account gave satisfaction, the writer would get the cottage prepared for the tenant immediately, and the lady might take possession at the time mentioned on the 1st of June. The day after finding this letter, Villiers set out for Wales. But first he persuaded Ethel to spend the interval of his absence at Longfield. She had lately fretted much concerning her mother, and as she was still nursing her baby, Edward became uneasy at her pale cheeks and thinness. Ethel was anxious to preserve her health for her child. She felt that her uneasiness and pining would be lessened by a removal into the country. She was useless in London, and there was something in her residence in her mother's house, in the aspect of the streets, and the memory of what she had suffered there, and the fear that Lady Lodore was enduring a worse repetition of the same evils, that agitated and preyed upon her. Her aunt had pressed her very much to come and see her, and she wrote to say that she might be expected on the following day. She bade adieu to Villiers with more of hope with regard to his success than she had formerly felt. She became half convinced that her mother was not in London. Fanny supported her in these ideas. They talked continually of all they knew, of the illness of Lady Lodore, of her firmness of purpose in not sending for her daughter, or altering her plans in consequence. They comforted themselves that the air of Wales would restore her health, and the beauty of the scenery and the freedom of nature soothe her mind. They were full of hope, of more, of expectation. Ethel, indeed, had at one time proposed accompanying her husband, but she yielded to his entreaties, and to the fear suggested that she might injure her child's health. Villiers' motions would be more prompt without her. They separated. Ethel wrote to Savile a letter to find him at Paris, containing an account of their new discoveries, and then prepared for her journey to Essex with Fanny, her baby, and the beautiful little Clorinda Savile, who had been left under her care on the following day. End of Volume 3, Chapter 15. Section 52 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley, Volume 3, Chapter 16. I am not one who much or oft delights to season my friends with personal talk, of friends who live within an easy walk, or neighbors daily, weekly in my sight, and for my chance acquaintance, ladies bright. Sons, mothers, maidens, withering on the stalk, these all wear out of me like forms with chalk painted on rich men's floors, for one feast night. Wordsworth. Mrs. Elizabeth Fitzhenry returned to Longfield from Marystow Castle at the end of the month of November. She gladly came back in all the dinginess and bleakness of that dismal season to her beloved seclusion at Longfield. The weather was dreary, a black frost invested everything with its icy chains. The landscape looked disconsolate, and now and then wintry blasts brought on snowstorms and howled loudly through the long dark nights. The amiable spinster drew her chair close to the fire. With half-shut eyes she contemplated the glowing embers, and recalled many past winters just like this, when Lodore was alive and in America, or diving yet deeper into memory, when the honored chair she now occupied had been dignified by her father, and she had tried to soothe his querulous complaints on the continued absence of her brother Henry. When, instead of these familiar thoughts, the novel ones of Ethel and Villiers intruded themselves, she rubbed her eyes to be quite sure that she did not dream. It was a lamentable change, and who the cause? Even she, whose absence had been, she felt, wickedly lamented at Marystow Castle, Cornelia Santerre, she who in an evil hour had become Lady Lodore, and who would before God answer for the disasters and untimely death of her ill-fated husband. With any but Mrs. Fitzhenry, such accusations had, after the softening process of time, been changed to an admission that, despite her errors, Lady Lodore had rather been misled and mistaken than heinously faulty, and her last act in sacrificing so much to her daughter, although the extent of her sacrifice was unknown to her sister-in-law, had cancelled her former delinquencies. But the prejudiced old lady was not so easily mollified. She was harsh alone towards her, but all the gall of her nature was collected and expended on the head of her brother's widow. Probably an instinctive feeling of her unreasonableness made her more violent. Her language was bitter whenever she alluded to her. She rejoiced at her absence, and instead of entering into Ethel's gratitude and impatience, she fervently prayed that she might never appear on the scene again. Mrs. Elizabeth Fitzhenry was less of a gossip than any maiden lady who had ever lived singly in the centre of a little village. Her heart was full of the dead and the absent, of past events and their long train of consequences, so that the history of the inhabitants of her village possessed no charm for her. If any one among them suffered from misfortune, she endeavored to relieve them, and if any died, she lamented, moralized on the passage of time, and talked of Lodore's death. But the scandal, the marriages, the feuds, and wonderful things that came to pass at Longfield appeared childish and contemptible, the flickering of earth-born tapers compared to the splendor, the obscuration, and final setting of the celestial luminary which had been the pole star of her life. It was from this reason that Mrs. Fitzhenry had not heard of the lady who lodged at Dame Nixon's cottage in the Vale of Bewling, till the time when, after having exhausted the curiosity of Longfield, she was almost forgotten. The lady, she was known by no other name, had arrived in the town during Mrs. Fitzhenry's visit to Marystow Castle. She had arrived in her own chariot, unattended by any servant. The following day she had taken up her abode at Dame Nixon's cottage, saying that she was only going to stay a week. She had continued there for more than 3 months. Dame Nixon's cottage was situated about 1.5 miles from Longfield. It stood alone in a little hollow embowered by trees. The ground behind rose to a slight upland, and a rill trickled through the garden. You got to it by a bypath, which no wheeled vehicle could traverse, though a horse might, and it was indeed the very dingle and cottage which Ethel had praised during her visit into Essex in the preceding year. The silence and seclusion were in summer tranquilizing and beautiful, in winter sad and drear. The fields were swampy in wet weather, and in snow and frost it seemed cut off from the rest of the world. Dame Nixon and her granddaughter lived there alone. The girl had been engaged to be married, her lover jilted her, and wedded a richer bride. The story is so old that it is to be wondered that women have not ceased to lament so common an occurrence. Poor Margaret was, on the contrary, struck to the heart. She despised herself for being unable to preserve her lover's affections, rather than the deceiver for his infidelity. She neglected her personal appearance, nor ever showed herself among her former companions, except to support her grandmother to church. Her false lover sat in the adjoining pew. She fixed her eyes on her prayer book during the service, and on the ground as she went away. She did not wish him to see the change which his faithlessness had wrought, for surely it would afflict him. Once there had not bloomed a fresher or gayer rose in the fields of Essex. Now she had grown thin and pale. Her young light step had become slow and heavy. Sickness and sorrow made her eyes hollow, and her cheeks sunken. She avoided every one, devoting herself to attendance on her grandmother. Dame Nixon was nearly doting. Life was ebbing fast from her old frame. Her best pleasure was to sun herself in the garden in summer, or to bask before the winter's fire. While enjoying these delights, her dimmed eyes brightened, and a smile wreathed her withered lips. She said, "Ah, this is comfortable. while her broken-hearted grandchild envied a state of being which could content itself with mere animal enjoyment. They were very poor. Margaret had to work hard, but the thoughts of the head, or at least the feelings of the heart, need not wait on the labor of the hands. The Sunday visit to church kept alive her pain. Her very prayers were bitter, breathed close to the deceiver, and her who had usurped her happiness. The memory and anticipation haunted her through the week. She was often blinded by tears as she patiently pursued her household duties or her toil in their little garden. Her hands were hardened with work, her throat, her face sunburnt, but exercise and occupation did not prevent her from wasting away, or her cheek from becoming sunk and wan. Dame Nixon's cottage was poor but roomy. Some years before, a gentleman from London had in a freak hired 2 rooms in it, and furnished them. Since then she had sometimes let them, and now they were occupied by the stranger lady. At first all 3 of the inhabitants appeared each Sunday at church. The lady was dressed in spotless and simple white, and so closely veiled that no one could see her face. Of course she was beautiful. Soon after Mrs. Elizabeth's return from Marystow Castle, it was discovered that first the lady stayed away, and soon that the whole party absented themselves on Sunday. And as this defalcation demanded inquiry, it was discovered that a pony chaise took them 3 miles off to the church of the nearest village. This was a singular and yet a beneficial change. The false swain must rejoice at losing sight of the memento of his sin, and Margaret would certainly pray with a freer heart when she no longer shrunk from his gaze and that of his wife. It was not until the end of January that Mrs. Elizabeth heard of the lady. It was not till the beginning of February that she asked a single question about her. In January, passing the inn-yard, the curate's wife, who was walking with her, said, "There is the chariot belonging to the lady who lodges at Dame Nixon's cottage. I wonder who she is. The arms are painted out." "Ah, Dame Nixon has a lodger, then. That is a good thing. It will help her through the winter. I have not seen her or her daughter at church lately." "No," replied the other, "they go now to Bewling Church." "I am glad to hear it," said Mrs. Fitzhenry. "It is much better for poor Margaret not to come here." The conversation went on, and the lady was alluded to, but no questions were asked or curiosity excited. In February she heard from the doctor's wife that the doctor had been to the cottage, and that the lady was indisposed. She heard at the same time that this lady had refused to receive the visits of the curate's lady and the doctor's lady, excusing herself that she was going to leave Essex immediately. This had happened 2 months before. On hearing of her illness, Mrs. Elizabeth thought of calling on her, but this stopped her. "It is very odd," said the doctor's wife. "She came in her own carriage, and yet has no servants. She lives in as poor a way as can be, down in that cottage. Yet my husband says she is more like the Queen of England in her looks and ways than any one he ever saw." "Like the Queen of England?" said Mrs. Fitzhenry. "What queen? Queen Charlotte?" who had been the queen of the greater part of the good lady's life. "She is as young and beautiful as an angel," said the other, half angry. "It is very mysterious." She did not look downcast like, as if anything was wrong, but was as cheerful and condescending as could be. "Condescending, doctor?" said I, for my husband used the word. "You don't want condescension from a poor body lodging at Dame Nixon's." "A poor body?" said he in a huff. "She is more of a lady, indeed more like the Queen of England than any rich body you ever saw. And what is odd, no one knows her name. Dame Nixon and Margaret always call her Lady. The very marks are picked out from her pocket handkerchiefs. Yet I did hear that there was a coronet, plain to be seen on one, a thing impossible unless she was a poor castaway. And the doctor says he'd lay his life that she was nothing of that. He must know her name when he makes out her bill, and I told him to ask it plump. But he puts off and puts off till I am out of all patience." A misty, confused sense of discomfort stole over Mrs. Elizabeth when she heard of the coronet in the corner of the pocket handkerchief. but it passed away without suggesting any distinct idea to her mind. Nor did she feel curiosity about the stranger. She was too much accustomed to the astonishment, the conjectures, the gossip of Longfield to suppose that there was any real foundation for surprise, because its wonder-loving inhabitants choose to build up a mystery out of every common occurrence of life. The absence of inquisitiveness must long have kept Mrs. Fitzhenry in ignorance of who her neighbor was, and the inhabitants of Longfield would probably have discovered it before her, had not the truth been revealed even before she entertained a suspicion that there was any secret to be found out. "I beg your pardon, ma'am," said her maid to her one evening, as she was superintending the coucher of the worthy spinster. "I think you ought to know, though I am afraid you may be angry." The woman hesitated. Her mistress encouraged her. "If it is anything I ought to know, Wilmot, tell it at once, and don't be afraid. What has happened to you?" "To me, ma'am? La, nothing," replied the maid. "It's something about the lady at Dame Nixon's, only you commanded me never to speak the name of—" And again the good woman stopped short. Mrs. Fitzhenry, a little surprised and somewhat angry, bade her go on. At length, in plain words, she was told, "Why, ma'am, the lady down the vale is no other than my lady, than Lady Lodore." "Ridiculous! Who told you so?" "My own eyes, ma'am. I shouldn't have believed anything else. I saw the lady, and it was my lady, as sure as I stand here." "But how could you know her? It is years since you saw her." "Yes, ma'am," said the woman, with a smile of superiority. "But it is not easy to forget Lady Lodore." "See her yourself, ma'am. You will know then that I am right." Wilmot had lived 20 years with Mrs. Fitzhenry. She had visited town with her at the time of Ethel's christening. She had been kept in vexatious ignorance of subsequent events, till the period of the visit of her mistress and niece to London 2 years before, when she indemnified herself. Through the servants of Villiers and of the Misses Saville, she had learnt a vast deal, and not satisfied with mere hearsay, she had seen Lady Lodore several times, getting into her carriage at her own door, and had even been into her house. Such energy is there in a liberal curiosity. The same disinterested feeling had caused her to go down to Dame Nixon's, with an offer from her mistress of service to the lady, hearing she was ill. She went perfectly unsuspicious of the wonderful discovery she was about to make, and was thus rewarded beyond her most sanguine hopes by being in possession of a secret known to herself alone. The keeping of a secret is, however, a post of no honor, if all knowledge be confined to the possessor alone. Mrs. Wilmot was tolerably faithful with all her love of knowledge. She was sure it would vex her mistress if Lady Lodore's strange place of abode were known at Longfield, and Mrs. Fitzhenry was consequently the first person to whom she had hinted the fact. All this account she detailed with great volubility. Her mistress recommended discretion most earnestly, and at the same time expressed a doubt whether her information was correct. "I wish you would go and judge for yourself, ma'am," said the maid. "God forbid!" exclaimed Mrs. Fitzhenry. "God grant I never see Lady Lodore again. She will go soon. You tell me that Dame Nixon says she is only staying till she is well. She will go soon, and it need never be known, except to ourselves, Wilmot, that she was ever here." There was a dignity in this eternal mystery that somewhat compensated for the absence of wonder and fuss, which the woman had anticipated with intense pleasure. She assured her mistress over and over again of her secrecy and discretion, and was dismissed with the exhortation to forget all she had learnt as quickly as possible. Wherefore did she come here? What can she be doing? Mrs. Fitzhenry asked herself over and over again. She could not guess. It was strange, it was mysterious, and some mischief was at the bottom. But she would go soon. Would that she were already gone. It must be mentioned that Mrs. Elizabeth Fitzhenry had left Marystow Castle before the arrival of Mr. Gayland, and had therefore no knowledge of the still more mysterious cloud that enveloped Lady Lodore's absence. Ignorant of her self-destroying sacrifices and generosity, her pity was not excited, her feelings were all against her. She counted the days as they passed, and looked wistfully at Wilmot, hoping that she would quickly bring tidings of the lady's departure. In vain. The doctor ceased to visit the cottage, but the lady remained. All at once the doctor visited it again with greater assiduity than ever, not on account of his beautiful patient, but Dame Nixon had had a paralytic stroke, and the kind lady had sent for him, and promised to defray all the expenses of the poor woman's illness. All this was truly vexatious. Mrs. Fitzhenry fretted, and even asked Wilmot questions, but the unwelcome visitor was still there. Wherefore? What could have put so disagreeable a whim into her head? The good lady could think of no motive, while she considered her presence an insult. She was still more annoyed when she received a letter from Ethel. It had been proposed that Mr. and Mrs. Villiers should pay her a visit in the spring, but now Ethel wrote to say that she might be immediately expected. I have strange things to tell you about my dear mother, wrote Ethel. It is very uncertain where she is. Horatio can hear nothing of her at Paris, and will soon return. Edward is going to Wales, as there seems a great likelihood that she has secluded herself there. While he is away, you may expect me. I shall not be able to stay long. He will come at the end of a week to fetch me. Mrs. Fitzhenry shuddered. Her prejudices were stronger than ever. She experienced the utmost wretchedness from the idea that the residence of Lady Lodore would be discovered and a family union effected. It seemed desecration to the memory of her brother, ruin to Ethel, the greatest misfortune that could befall any of them. Her feelings were exaggerated, but they were on that account the more powerful. How could she avert the evil? A remedy must be sought, and she fixed on one, a desperate one in truth, which appeared to her the sole mode of saving them all from the greatest disasters. She resolved to visit Lady Lodore, to represent to her the impropriety and wickedness of her having any intercourse with her daughter, and to entreat her to depart before Ethel's arrival. Her violence might almost seem madness, but all people who live in solitude become to a certain degree insane. Their views of things are not corrected by comparing them with those of others, and the strangest want of proportion always reigns in their ideas and sentiments. End of Volume 3, Chapter 16. Section 53 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley, Volume 3, Chapter 17. So loth we part from all we love, from all the links that bind us, so turn our hearts where'er we rove, to those we've left behind us. Thomas Moore. On the following morning, Mrs. Elizabeth Fitzhenry drove to the Vale of Bewling. It was the last day of February. The March winds were hushed as yet. The breezes were balmy, the sunshine cheerful. A few soft clouds flecked the heavens, and the blue sky appeared between them calm and pure. Each passing air breathed life and happiness. It caressed the cheek, and the swelling buds of the trees felt its quickening influence. The almond trees were in bloom, the pear blossoms began to whiten, the tender green of the young leaves showed themselves here and there among the hedges. The old lady felt the cheering influence, and would have become even gay, had not the idea of the errand she was on checked her spirits. Sometimes the remembrance that she was really going to see her sister-in-law absolutely startled her. Once or twice she thought of turning back. She passed through the lanes, and then, alighting from her carriage, walked by a raised footway, across some arable fields, and again through a little grove. The winding path made a turn, and Dame Nixon's white, low-roofed cottage was before her. Everything about it looked trim, but very humble, and it was unadorned during this early season by the luxury of flowers and plants, which usually give even an appearance of elegance to an English cottage. Mrs. Fitzhenry opened the little gate. Her knees trembled as she walked through the scanty garden, which breathed of the new-sprung violets. The entrance to the cottage was by the kitchen. She entered this and found Margaret occupied by a culinary preparation for her grandmother. Mrs. Fitzhenry asked after the old woman's health, and thus gained a little time. Margaret answered in her own former quiet yet cheerful voice. She was changed from what she had been a few weeks before. The bloom had not returned to her cheeks, but they no longer appeared streaked with deathly paleness. Her motions had lost the heaviness that showed a mind ill at ease. Mrs. Elizabeth congratulated her on the restoration of her health. "Oh, yes," she replied with a blush, "I am not the same creature I used to be, thank God, and the angel he has sent us here. If my poor grandmother would but get well, I should be quite happy, but that is asking too much at her time of life." The old lady made no further observations. She did not wish to hear the praises of her sister-in-law. "Your lodger is still here?" at length she said. "Yes, God be praised," replied Margaret. "Will you give her my compliments and say I am here and that I wish to see her?" "Yes, ma'am," said Margaret, "only the lady has refused to see any one, and she does not like being asked." "I do not wish to be impertinent or intrusive," answered Mrs. Elizabeth. "Only tell her my name, and if she makes any objection, of course she will do as she likes. Where is she?" "She is sitting with my poor grandmother. The nurse, heaven bless her, she would hire a nurse to spare me, as she said, is laying down to sleep, and she said she would watch by grandmother while I got the gruel. But it's ready now, and I will go and tell her." Away tripped Margaret, leaving her guest lost in wonder. Lady Lodore watching the sick bed of an old cottager, Lady Lodore immured in a poverty-stricken abode, fit only for the poorer sort of country people. It was more than strange, it was miraculous. Yet she refused to accompany poor Henry to America. There must be some strange mystery in all this that does not tell well for her. So bitterly uncharitable was the unforgiving old lady towards her brother's widow. She ruminated on these things for a minute or two, and then Margaret came to usher her into the wicked one's presence. The sitting-room destined for the lodger was neat, though very plain. The walls were wainscoted and painted white, the windows small and latticed. The furniture was old black, shining mahogany, the chairs high-backed and clumsy, the table heavy and incommodious, the fireplace large and airy, and the shelf of the mantelpiece almost as high as the low ceiling. There were a few things of a more modern construction, a comfortable sofa, a rosewood bureau, and large folding screen. Near the fire was a large easy-chair of Gillos's manufacture, 2 light cane ones, and 2 small tables. Vases filled with hyacinths, jonquils, and other spring flowers stood on one, and an embroidery frame occupied the other. There was a perfume of fresh gathered flowers in the room, which the open window rendered very agreeable. Lady Lodore was standing near the fire, for Wilmot was not mistaken, and it was she indeed who now presented herself to Mrs. Fitzhenry's eyes. She might be agitated, she did not show it. She came forward and held out her hand. "Dear Bessie," she said, "you are very kind to visit me. I thank you very much." The poor recluse was overpowered. The cordiality of the greeting frightened her. She who had come full of bitter reproach and hard purposes to be thanked with that sweet voice and smile. "I thought," at length she stammered out, "that you did not wish to be known. I am glad you are not offended, Cornelia." "Offended by kindness? Oh no, it is true. I do not wish that it should be known that I am here. But since, by some strange accident, you have discovered me, how can I help being grateful for your visit? I am indeed glad to see you. It is so long since I have heard anything. Ah, dear Bessie, tell me, how is Ethel?" Tears glistened in the mother's eyes. She asked many questions, and Mrs. Fitzhenry a little recovered her self-possession as she answered them. She looked at Lady Lodore. She was changed. She could not fail of being changed after so many years. She was no longer a beautiful girl, but she was a lovely woman. Despite the traces of years which, however lightly they impressed, yet might be discerned. Expression so embellished her that it was impossible not to admire. Brilliancy had given place to softness, animation to serenity. Still she was fair, still her silken hair clustered on her brow, and her sweet eyes were full of fire. Her smile had more than its former charm. It came from the heart. Mrs. Fitzhenry was not, however, to be subdued by a little outward show. She was there, who had betrayed and deserted, such were the energetic words she was accustomed to employ, the noble, broken-hearted Lodore. The thought steeled her purpose, and she contrived at last to ask whether Lady Lodore was going to remain much longer in Essex. "I have been going every day since I came here. In a few weeks I shall certainly be gone. Why do you ask?" "Because I thought, that is, you have made a secret of your being here, and I expect Ethel in a day or two, and she would certainly discover you." "Why should she not?" asked Lady Lodore. "Why should you be averse to my seeing Ethel?" It is very difficult to say a disagreeable thing, especially to one unaccustomed to society, and who is quite ignorant of the art of concealing the sting of her intentions by flowery words. Mrs. Fitzhenry said something about her sister-in-law's own wishes, and the desire expressed by Lodore that there should be no intercourse between the mother and daughter. Cornelia's eyes flashed fire. "Am I," she exclaimed, "to be always the sacrifice? Is my husband's vengeance to pursue me beyond his grave, even till I reach mine? Unjust as he was, he would not have desired this." Mrs. Elizabeth coloured with anger. Lady Lodore continued, "Pardon me, Bessie, I do not wish to say anything annoying to you, or in blame of Lodore. God knows I did him great wrong, but—" "Oh, Cornelia," cried the old lady, "do you indeed acknowledge that you were to blame?" Lady Lodore smiled and said, "I were strangely blind to the defects of my own character, and to the consequences of my actions, were I not conscious of my errors. But retrospection is useless, and the punishment is sufficiently severe. Lodore himself would not have perpetuated his resentment had he lived only a very little while longer. But I will speak frankly to you, Bessie, as frankly as I may, and you shall decide on my further stay here. From circumstances which it is immaterial to explain, I have resolved on retiring into absolute solitude. I shall never live in London again, never again see any of my old friends and acquaintances. The course of my life is entirely changed, and whether I live here or elsewhere, I shall live in obscurity and poverty. I do not wish Ethel to know this. She would wish to assist me, and she has scarcely enough for herself. I do not like being a burthen. I do not like being pitied. I do not like being argued with, or to have my actions commented upon. You know that my disposition was always independent." Mrs. Elizabeth assented with a sigh, casting up her eyes to heaven. Lady Lodore smiled and went on, "You think this is a strange place for me to live in. Whether here or elsewhere, I shall never live in any better. I shall be fortunate if I find myself as well off when I leave Essex, for the people here are good and honest, and the poor girl loves me. It is always pleasant to be loved." A tear again filled Cornelia's eyes. She tried to animate herself to smile. "I have nothing to love in all the wide world except Ethel. I do love her. Every one must love her. She is so gentle, so kind, so warm-hearted and beautiful. I love her more than my own heart's blood. She is my child, part of that blood, part of myself, the better part. I have seen little of her, but every look and word is engraved on my heart. I love her voice, her smiles, the pressure of her soft white hand. Pity me, dear Bessie. I am never to see any of these, which are all that I love on earth, again. This idea fills me with regret, with worse, with sorrow. There is a grave not far from here which contains one you loved beyond all others. What would you not give to see him alive once again? To visit his tomb is a consolation to you. I must not see even the walls within which my blessed child lives. You alone can help me, can be of comfort to me. Do not refuse, do not send me away. If I leave this place, I shall go to some secluded nook in Wales, and be quite, quite alone. The sun will shine and the grass will grow at my feet, but my heart will be dead within me, and I shall pine and die. I have intended to do this. I have waited only till the sufferings of the poor woman here should be at an end, that I may be of service to Margaret, and then go. Your visit, which I fancied meant in kindness, has put other thoughts into my head. Do not object to my staying here. Let me remain, and do yet more for me. Come to me sometimes and bring me tidings of my daughter. Tell me what she says, how she looks. Tell me that she is at each moment well and happy. Ah, do this, dear Bessie, and I will bless you. I shall never see her, at least not for years. There are many things to prevent it. Yet how could I drag out those years quite estranged from her? My heart has died within me each time I have thought of it. But I can live. As I say, I shall expect you every now and then to come and talk to me of her. She need never know that I am so near. She comes so seldom to Essex. I shall soon be forgotten at Longfield. Will you consent? You will do a kind action, and God will bless you. Mrs. Fitzhenry was one of those persons who always find it difficult to say no, and Lady Lodore asked with so much earnestness that she commanded. She felt that her request ought to be granted, and therefore it was impossible to refuse it. Before she well knew what she had said, the good lady had yielded her consent and received her sister-in-law's warm and heartfelt thanks. Mrs. Fitzhenry looked round the room. "But how can you think of staying here, Cornelia?" she said. "This place is not fit for you. I should have thought that you could never have endured such homely rooms." "Do you think them so bad?" replied the lady. "I think them very pleasant, for I have done with pride, and I find peace and comfort here. Look," she continued, throwing open a door that led into the garden, "is not that delightful? This garden is very pretty. That clear rivulet murmurs by with so lulling a sound. And look at these violets, are they not beautiful? I have planted a great many flowers, and they will soon come up. Do you not know how pleasant it is to watch the shrubs we plant and water and rear ourselves, to see the little green shoots peep out, and the leaves unfold, and then the flower blossom and expand, diffusing its delicious odor around, all, as it were, created by oneself, by one's own nursing, out of a bit of stick or an ugly bulb? This place is very pretty, I assure you. When the leaves are on the trees, they make a bower, and the grove behind the house is shady and leads to lanes and fields more beautiful than any I ever saw. I have loitered for hours in this garden and been quite happy. Now I shall be happier than ever, thanks to you. You will not forget me. Come as often as you can. You say that you expect Ethel soon?" Lady Lodore walked with her sister-in-law to the garden gate and beyond, through the little copse, still talking of her daughter. "I cannot go further," she said at last, "without a bonnet, so good-bye, dear Bessie. Come soon. Thank you for this visit." She held out her hand. Mrs. Fitzhenry took it, pressed it. A half-feeling came over her, as if she were about to kiss the cheek of her offending relative, but her heart hardened. She blushed, and muttering a hasty good-bye, she hurried away. She was bewildered, and after walking a few steps, she turned round and saw again the white dress of Cornelia as a turn in the path hid her. The grand, the exclusive Lady Lodore, the haughty, fashionable, worldly, heartless wife, thus metamorphosed into a tender-hearted mother, suing to her for crumbs of charitable love, and hiding all her boasted advantages in that low-roofed cottage. What could it all mean? Mrs. Fitzhenry walked on. Again she thought, how odd. I went there determining to persuade her to go away, and miserable at the thoughts of seeing her only once. And now I have promised to visit her often, and agreed that she shall live here. Have I not done wrong? What would my poor brother say? Yet I could not refuse. Poor thing, how could I refuse, when she said that she had nothing else to live for? Besides, to go away and live alone in Wales would be too dreadful, and she thanked me as if she were so grateful. I hope I have not done wrong. But how strange it is that Henry's widow should have become so poor. She has given up a part of her income to Ethel, but a great deal remains. What can she have done with it? She is mysterious, and there is never any good in mystery. Who knows what she may have to conceal? Mrs. Elizabeth got in her carriage, and each step of the horses took her farther from the web of enchantment which Cornelia had thrown over her. She is always strange. thus ran her meditations, and how am I to see her, and no one find it out? And what a story for Longfield, that Lady Lodore should be living in poverty in Dame Nixon's cottage. I forgot to tell her that. I forgot to say so many things I meant to say. I don't know why, except that she talked so much, and I did not know how to bring in my objections. But it cannot be right, and Ethel in her long rambles and rides with Miss Durham or Mr. Villiers will be sure to find her out. I wish I had not seen her. I will write and tell her I have changed my mind, and entreat her to go away. As it occurs to all really good-natured persons, it was very disagreeable to Mrs. Fitzhenry to be angry, and she visited the ill temper so engendered on the head of poor Cornelia. She disturbed herself by the idea of all the disagreeable things that might happen, of her sister-in-law's positive refusal to go. The very wording which she imagined for her intended letter puzzled and irritated her. She no longer felt the breath of spring as pleasant, but sat back in the chariot, nursing her wrath to keep it warm. When she reached her home, Ethel's carriage was at her door. The meeting, as ever, between aunt and niece was affectionate. Fanny was welcomed, the baby was kissed, and little Clorinda admired, but the theme nearest Ethel's heart was speedily introduced, her mother. The disquietudes she felt on her account, Mr. Savile's journey to Paris, the visit of Villiers to Wales to discover her place of concealment, the inutility of all their endeavours. "But why are they so anxious?" asked her aunt. "I can understand you. You have some fantastic notion about your mother. But how can Mr. Villiers desire so very much to find her?" "I could almost say," said Ethel, "that Edward is more eager than myself, though I should wrong my own affection and gratitude. But he was more unjust towards her, and thus he feels the weight of obligation more keenly. But perhaps, dear aunt, you do not know all that my dearest mother has done for us, the unparalleled sacrifices she has made." Then Ethel went on to tell her all that Mr. Galen had communicated, the sale of her jointure, the very small residue of money she had kept for herself, the entire payment of Villiers' debts, and afterwards the surrender of the remainder of her income and of her house to them. Her eyes glistened as she spoke, her heart, overflowing with admiration and affection, shone in her beautiful face, her voice was pregnant with sensibility, and her expressions full of deep feeling. Mrs. Elizabeth's heart was not of stone, far from it. It was, except in the one instance of her sister-in-law, made of pliable materials. She heard Ethel's story. She caught by sympathy the tenderness and pity she poured forth. She thought of Lady Lodore at the cottage, a dwelling so unlike any she had ever inhabited before, poverty-stricken and mean. She remembered her praises of it, her cheerfulness, the simplicity of taste which she displayed, the light-hearted content with which she spoke of every privation except the absence of Ethel. What before was mysterious wrong was now manifest heroism. The loftiness and generosity of her mind rose upon the old lady unclouded. Her own uncharitable deductions stung her with remorse. She continued to listen, and Ethel to narrate, and the big tears gathered in her eyes and rolled down her venerable cheeks, tears at once of repentance and admiration. End of Volume 3, Chapter 17.
Section 54 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley. Volume 3, Chapter 18. Repentance is a tender sprite. If aught on earth have heavenly might, 'tis lodged within her silent tear. Wordsworth. Mrs. Elizabeth Fitzhenry was not herself aware of all that Lady Lodore had suffered, or the extent of her sacrifices. She guessed darkly at them, but it was the detail that rendered them so painful, and, but for their motive, humiliating to one nursed in luxury, and accustomed to all those intermediate servitors and circumstances which stand between the rich and the bare outside of the working-day world. Cornelia shrunk from the address of those she did not know, and from the petty acts of daily life which had gone on before without her entering into their detail. Her illness at Newbury had been severe. She was attacked by the scarlet fever. The doctor had ordered her to be removed from the bustle of the inn, and a furnished villa had been taken for her, while she could only give a languid assent to propositions which she understood confusedly. She was a long time very ill, a long time weak and slowly convalescent. At length health dawned on her, accompanied by a disposition attuned to content and a wish for tranquillity. Her residence was retired, commodious, and pretty. She was pleased with it. She did not wish to remove, and was glad to procrastinate from day to day any consideration of the future. Thus it was a long time before the strength of her thoughts and purposes was renewed, or that she began to think seriously of where she was and what she was going to do. During the half-delirium, the disturbed and uncontrollable but not unmeaning reveries of her fever, the idea of visiting Lodore's grave had haunted her pertinaciously. She had often dreamt of it. At one time the tomb seemed to rise in a lonely desert, and the dead slept peacefully beneath sunshine or starlight. At another, storms and howling winds were around. Groans and sighs, mingled with the sound of the tempest, and menaces and reproaches against her, were breathed from the cold marble. Now her imagination pictured it within the aisles of a magnificent cathedral, and now again the real scene, the rustic church of Longfield, was vividly present to her mind. She saw the pathways through the green churchyard, the ruined ivy-mantled tower, which showed how much larger the edifice had been in former days, near which might be still discerned on high a niche containing the Holy Mother and Divine Child, the half-defaced porch on which rude monkish imagery was carved, the time-worn pews and painted window. She had never entered this church but once, many, many years ago, and it was strange how in sleep and fever-troubled reverie each portion of it presented itself distinctly and vividly to her imagination. During these perturbed visions, one other form and voice perpetually recurred. She heard Ethel continually repeat, "Come, come," and often her figure flitted round the tomb or sat beside it. Once, on awakening from a dream which impressed her deeply by the importunity and earnestness of her daughter's appeal, she was forcibly impelled to consider it her duty to obey, and she made a vow that on recovering from her illness she would visit her husband's grave. Now, while pondering on the humiliations and cheerless necessities which darkened her future, and rousing herself to form some kind of resolution concerning them, this dream was repeated, and on awakening the memory of her forgotten vow renewed itself in her. She dwelt on it with pleasure. Here was something to be done that was not mere wretchedness and lonely wandering, something that, connecting her with the past, took away the sense of desertion and solitude so hard to bear. In the morning at breakfast it so chanced that she read in the Morning Herald a little paragraph announcing that Viscount Maristow was entertaining a party of friends at Maristow Castle, among whom were Mr. and Mrs. Villiers and the Honourable Mrs. Elizabeth Fitzhenry. This was a fortunate coincidence. The dragon ceased for a moment to watch the garden, and she might avail herself of its absence to visit its treasure unnoticed and unknown. She put her project into immediate execution. She crossed the country, passing through London on her way to Longfield. She arrived. Without delay she fulfilled her purpose. She entered the church and viewed the tablet inscribed simply with the name of Lodore, and the date of his birth and death. The words were few and commonplace, but they were eloquent to her. They told her that the cold, decaying shape lay beneath which, in the pride of life and love, had clasped her in its arms as its own for evermore. Short-lived had been the possession. She had loosened the tie even while thought and feeling ruled the now insentient brain. He had been scarcely less dead to her while inhabiting the distant Illinois, than now that a stone placed above him gave visible token of his material presence, and the eternal absence of his immortal part. Cornelia had never before felt so sensibly that she had been a wife neglecting her duties, despising a vow she had solemnly pledged, estranging herself from him, who by religious ordinance and the laws of society alone had privilege to protect and love her. Nor had she before felt so intimately the change that she was a widow, that her lover, her husband, the father of her child, the forsaken dead Lodore, was indeed no part of the tissue of life, action, and feeling to which she belonged. Solitude and sickness had before awakened many thoughts in her mind, and she recalled them as she sat beside her dead husband's grave. She looked into her motives, tried to understand the deceits she had practiced on herself, and to purify her conscience. She meditated on time, that law of the world which is so mysterious and so potent, ruling us despotically, yet wholly unappreciated till we think upon it. Petrarch says that he was never so young but that he knew that he was growing old. Lady Lodore had never thought of this till a few months back. It seemed to her that she had never known it until now, that she felt that she was older than the vain and lovely bride of Lodore, than the haughty and high-spirited friend of Casimir Lysinski. And where was Casimir? She had never heard of him again. She had scarcely ever thought of him. He had grown older too. Change, the effects of passion or of destiny, must have visited him also. They were all embarked on one mighty stream. Lodore had gained a haven, but the living were still at the mercy of the vast torrent. Whither would it hurry them? There was a charm in these melancholy and speculative thoughts to the beautiful exile, for we may be indeed as easily exiled by a few roods of ground as by mountains and seas. A strong decree of fate banished Cornelia from the familiar past into an unknown and strange present. Still she clung to the recollection of bygone years, and for the first time gave way to reflections full of scenes and persons to be seen no more. The tomb beside which she lingered was an outward sign of these past events, and she did not like to lose sight of it so soon. She heard that Mrs. Elizabeth Fitzhenry was to remain away for a month. So much time at least was hers. She inquired for lodgings, and was directed to Dame Nixon's cottage. She was somewhat dismayed at first by its penurious appearance, but it would do for a few days, and she found that what would serve for a few days might serve for months. Man wants but little here below, nor wants that little long. Most true for solitary man. It is society that increases his desires. If Lady Lodore had been visited in her humble dwelling by the least regarded among her acquaintances, she would have felt keenly its glaring deficiencies. But although used to luxury, Margaret's cuisine sufficed for herself alone. The low-roofed rooms were high enough, and the latticed windows which let in the light of heaven fulfilled their purpose as well as the plate glass and lofty embrasures of a palace. Lady Lodore was obliged also to consider one other thing, which forms so large a portion of our meditations in real life, her purse. She found, when settled in the cottage in the Vale of Bewling, that her stock of money was reduced to £100. She could not cross the country and establish herself at a distance from London with this sum only. She had before looked forward to selling her jewels and carriage as to a distant event. But now she felt that it was the next thing she must do. She shrunk from it naturally. The very idea of revisiting London, of seeing its busy shops and streets, once so full of life and its purposes to her, and in which she would now wander, an alien, was inconceivably saddening. She was willing to put off the necessity as long as possible, and thus continued to procrastinate her departure from Essex. Mrs. Fitzhenry returned, but she could neither know nor dream of the vicinity of her sister-in-law. We are apt to think, when we know nothing of anyone, that no one knows anything of us. Experience can scarcely teach us that the reverse of this is often the truth. Seeing only an old woman in her dotage, and a poor love-sick girl who knew nothing beyond the one event which had blasted all her happiness, she never heard the inhabitants of Longfield mentioned, and believed that she was equally unheard of by them. Then her indisposition protracted her stay, and now the mortal illness of the poor woman, for she had become interested in Margaret and promised to befriend her, and in case of her grandmother's death, to take her from a spot where every association and appearance kept open the wounds inflicted by her unfaithful lover. Time had thus passed on, now sad, now cheerful. She tried to banish every thought of the future, and to make the occurrences of each day fill and satisfy her mind. She lived obscurely and humbly, and perhaps as wisely as mortal may in this mysterious world, where hope is perpetually followed by disappointment, and action by repentance and regret. The days succeeded to each other in one unvaried tenor. The weather was cheerful, the breath of spring animating. She watched the swelling of the buds, the peeping heads of the crocuses, the opening of the anemones and wild windflowers, and at last the sweet odor of the newborn violets, with all the interest created by novelty. Not that she had not observed and watched these things before with transitory pleasure. But now the operations of nature filled all her world. The earth was no longer merely the dwelling place of her acquaintance, the stage on which the business of society was carried on, but the mother of life, the temple of God, the beautiful and varied storehouse of bounteous nature. Dwelling on these ideas, Cornelia often thought of Horatio Saville, whose conversations, now remembered, were the source whence she drew the knowledge and poetry of her present reveries. As solitude and nature grew lovely in her eyes, she yearned yet more fondly for the one who could embellish all she saw. Yet while her mind needed a companion so congenial to her present feelings, her heart was fuller of Ethel. Her affection for Saville was a calm though deep-rooted sentiment, resulting from the conviction that she should find entire happiness if united to him, and in an esteem, or rather an enthusiastic admiration of his talents and virtues, that led her to dwell with complacency on the hope that he still remembered and loved her. But the human heart is jealous, and with difficulty admits two emotions of equal force, and her love for her daughter was the master passion. The instinct of nature spoke audibly within her. The atoms of her frame seemed alive, each one as she thought of her. Often her tears flowed, often her eyes brightened with gladness when alone, and the beloved image of her beautiful daughter, as she saw her last, smiling amidst penury and indignity, was her dearest companion by day and night. She alone made her present situation endurable, and yet separation from her was irksome beyond expression. Was she never to see or hear of her more? It was very hard. She implored Providence to change the harsh decree. She longed inexpressibly for one word that had reference to her, one event, however slight, which should make her existence palpable. When Margaret announced Mrs. Fitzhenry, her heart bounded with joy. She could ask concerning Ethel, hear of her. Her countenance was radiant with delight, and she really for a moment thought her sister-in-law's visit was meant in kindness, since so much pleasure was the result. This conviction had produced the very thing it anticipated. She had given poor Bessie no time to announce the actual intention with which she came. She had borne away her sullen mood by force of sweet smiles and sweeter words, and saw her depart with gladdened spirits, whispering to herself the fresh hopes and fond emotions which filled her bosom. She walked back to her little garden, and stooped to gather some fresh violets, and to prop a drooping jonquil heavy with its burthen of sweet blooms. She inhaled the vernal odours with rapture. Yes, she thought, nature is the refuge and home for women. They have no public career, no aim nor end beyond their domestic circle, but they can extend that and make all the creations of nature their own, to foster and do good to. We complain, when shut up in cities, of the niggard rules of society, which gives us only the drawing-room or ball-room in which to display our talents, and which, for ever turning the sympathy of those around us into envy on the part of women, or what is called love on that of men, besets our path with dangers or sorrows. But throw aside all vanity. No longer seek to surpass your own sex, nor to inspire the other with feelings which are pregnant with disquiet or misery, and which seldom end in mutual benevolence. Turn your steps to the habitation which God has given as befitting his creatures. Contemplate the lovely ornaments with which he has blessed the earth. Here is no heart-burning nor calumny. It is better to love, to be of use to one of these flowers, than to be the admired of the many, the mere puppet of one's own vanity. Lady Lodore entered the house. She asked concerning her poor hostess, and learnt that she slept. For a short time she employed herself with her embroidery. Her thoughts were all awake, and as her fingers created likenesses of the flowers she loved, several times her eyes filled with tears, as she thought of Ethel, and how happy she could be if her fate permitted her to cultivate her affection and enjoy her society. It is very sad, she thought. Only a few minutes ago my spirits were buoyant, gladdened as they were by Bessy's visit, but they flag again when I think of my loneliness and the unreplying silence of this place. What is to become of me? I shall remain here. Yes, I shall not banish myself to some inhospitable nook, where I should never hear her name. But am I not to see her again? Am I to be nothing to her? Is she satisfied with my absence? And are they all to whom I am bound by ties of consanguinity or affection, indifferent to the knowledge of whether I exist or not? Nothing gives token to them of my life. It is as if the grave had closed abruptly over me, and had it closed, thus I should have been mourned in coldness and neglect. Again her eyes were suffused, but as she wiped away the blinding tears, she was recalled from her reflections by the bright rays of the sun which entered her little room. She threw open the door and stepped out into the garden. The sun was setting. The atmosphere was calm and lighted up by golden beams. The few clouds were dyed in the same splendid hues. The birds sent forth a joyous song at intervals, and a band of rooks passed above the little wood, cawing loudly. The air was balmy. The indescribable freshness of spring was abroad, interpenetrating and cheerful. Cornelia's melancholy fled as she felt and gave way to its influence. God blesses all things, she thought, and he will also bless me. Much wrong have I done, but love, pure and disinterested, is in my heart, and I shall be repaid. My own sweet Ethel, I have sacrificed everything except my life for your sake, and I would add my life to the gift, could it avail you. I ask but for you and your love. The world has many blessings, and I have asked for them before with tears and anguish. But I give up all now, except you, my child. You are all the world to me. Will you not come even now, as I implore heaven to give you to me? She raised her eyes in prayer, and it seemed as if her wishes were to be accomplished. Surely, once in a life, God will grant the earnest entreaty of a loving heart. Cornelia believed that he would, that happiness was near at hand, and life not all a blank. She heard a rustling among the trees, a light step. Was it Margaret? She had scarcely asked herself this question when the dear object of her every thought and hope was before her and in her arms. Ethel had entered from the wood, had seen her mother, had sprung forward and clasped her to her heart. "My dear, dear child!" "Dearest mother!" repeated Ethel, as her eyes were filled with tears of delight. "Why did you go? Why conceal yourself? You do not know the anxiety we have suffered, and how very unhappy your absence has made us. But I have found you. Of all that have gone to seek you, I have found you. I deserve this reward, for I love you most of all." Lady Lodore returned her daughter's caresses, and her tears flowed fast for very joy. And then she turned to Mrs. Fitzhenry, who followed Ethel, but who had been outspeeded by her in her eagerness. The old lady's face was beaming with happiness. "Ah, Bessie, you've betrayed me, traitress! I did not expect this. I do not deserve such excessive happiness." "You deserve all, and much more than we can any of us bestow," cried Ethel, "except that your dear generous heart will repay you beyond any reward we can give, and you will be blessed in the happiness we owe to you alone. Edward is gone far away into Wales in quest of you." "And Angelica run after by the paladins?" said Lady Lodore, smiling through her tears. "Paladins, worthy the name," replied Ethel. "Horatio is even now on the salt seas for your sake. He is returning discomfited and hopeless from his journey of discovery to the Pyrenees. His zeal almost deserved the reward which I have found, yet who but she, for whom you sacrificed so much, ought to be the first to thank you? And while we all try to show you an inexpressible gratitude, ought not I to be the first to see, first to kiss, first, always the first, to love you? End of Volume 3, Chapter 18. Section 55 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley. Volume 3. Conclusion. None, I trust, repines at these delights. They are free and harmless. After distress at sea, the danger o'er, safety and welcome's better taste ashore. Ford. Thus the tale of Lodore is ended. The person who bore that title by right of descent has long slept in peace in the church of his native village. Neither his own passions nor those of others can renew the pulsations of his heart. The silver cord is loosed, and the pitcher broken at the fountain. His life had not been fruitless. The sedulous care and admirable education he had bestowed on Ethel would, had he lived, have compensated to him for his many sufferings, and been a source of pure and unfading joy to the end. He was not destined in this world to reap the harvest of his virtues, though his errors had been punished severely. Still his memory is the presiding genius of his daughter's life, and the name of Lodore contains for her a spell that dignifies existence in her own eyes, and incites her to render all her thoughts and actions such as her beloved father would have approved. It was fated that the evil which he did should die with him, but the good outlived him long, and was a blessing to those whom he loved far better than himself. She who received the title on her marriage henceforth continued her existence under another, and the wife of Seville, who soon after became Viscountess Maristow, loses her right to be chronicled in these pages. So few years indeed are passed since the period to which the last chapter brought us, that it may be safely announced that Cornelia Santerre possesses that happiness through her generosity and devoted affection, which she had lost through pride and self-exaltation. She wonders at her past self, and laments the many opportunities she lost for benefiting others, and proving herself worthy of their attachment. Her pride is gone, or rather, her pride is now placed in redeeming her faults. She is humble, knowing how much she was deceived in herself. She is forgiving, for she feels that she needs forgiveness. She looks on the track of years she has passed over as wasted, and she wishes to retrieve their loss. She respects, admires, in some sense it may be said, that she adores her husband. But even while consenting to be his, and thus securing her own happiness, she told him that her first duties were towards Ethel, and that he took a divided heart, over the better part of which reigned maternal love. Saville, the least egoistic of human beings, smiled to hear her name that a defect, which was in his own eyes her crowning virtue. Edward Villiers learned to prize worldly prosperity at its true value, and each day blesses the train of circumstances that led him to wed Ethel, even though poverty and suffering had followed close behind. Ethel herself might be said to have always been happy. She was incapable of being impressed by any sorrow that did not touch her for another's sake, and while she exerted herself to alleviate the pain endured by those she loved, she passed on unhurt. Heaven spared her life's most cruel evils. Death had done its worst when she lost her father. Now, surrounded by dear friends and the object of her husband's constant tenderness, she pursues a tranquil course, which for anyone to consider the most blissful allotted to mortals, they must have a heart like her own, faithful, affectionate, and generous. Mrs. Elizabeth Fitzhenry, kind and gentle Aunt Betsy, always felt her heaven clouded when she indulged in her aversion to her sister-in-law. She is happy now that she is reconciled to Cornelia. Strange to say, she loves her even more than she loves Ethel. She is more intimately connected in her mind with the memory of Lodore. She often visits her at Maristow Castle, in the neighbourhood of which Margaret is settled, being happily married. Colonel Villiers still lives in Paris. He is in a miserable state of poverty, difficulty, and ill health. His wife has deserted him. He neglected and outraged her, and she, in a fit of remorse, left him, and returned to nurse her father during a lingering illness, which is likely to continue to the end of his life, though he shows no symptoms of immediate decay. He is eager to lavish all his wealth on his child, if he can be sure that no portion of it is shared by her husband. With infinite difficulty, and at the cost of many privations, she, with a true woman's feelings, contrives to send him remittances now and then, though she receives in return neither thanks nor kindness. He pursues a course of dissipation in its most degraded form, a wretched hanger-on at resorts, misnamed of pleasure, gambling while he has any money to lose, trying to ruin others as he has been ruined. And thus we have done our duty in bringing under view, in a brief summary, the little that there is to tell of the personages who form the drama of this tale. One only remains to be mentioned, but it is not in a few tame lines that we can revert to the varied fate of Fanny Durham. She continued for some time among her beloved friends, innocent and calm as she was beautiful and wise. Circumstances at last led her away from them, and she has entered upon life. One who feels so deeply for others, and yet is so stern a censor over herself, at once so sensitive and so rigidly conscientious, so single-minded and upright, and yet open as day to charity and affection, cannot hope to pass from youth to age unharmed. Deceit and selfishness and the whole web of human passion must envelop her, and occasion her many sorrows. And the unworthiness of her fellow creatures inflict infinite pain on her noble heart. Still she cannot be contaminated. She will turn neither to the right nor left, but pursue her way unflinching, and in her lofty idea of the dignity of her nature, in her love of truth, and in her integrity, she will find support and reward in her various fortunes. What the events are that have already diversified her existence cannot now be recounted, and it would require the gift of prophecy to foretell the conclusion. In after times these may be told, and the life of Fanny Durham be presented as a useful lesson at once to teach what goodness and genius can achieve in palliating the woes of life, and to encourage those who would in any way imitate her by an example of calumny refuted by patience, errors rectified by charity, and the passions of our nature purified and ennobled by an undeviating observance of those moral laws on which all human excellence is founded. A love of truth in ourselves, and a sincere sympathy with our fellow creatures. End of Volume 3, and end of Lodore, by Mary Shelley.